Laurian never entered Tulip, yet his guns erased a century-old earldom. He did it to free one chained dwarf master smith, hundreds of miles away. Laurian studied grain ledgers in Greywood. Serena faced a broken assault under fire and lightning. Greywood's advantage was industrial gunpowder, backed by modern manufacturing logic. At 30 paces, its muskets punched straight through enchanted plate. Serena trapped fleeing mercenaries between enemy fire and her rifles. By morning, Valerius signed away Tulip, and Balan's family walked free. 2 weeks later, Laurian read the account over breakfast with the casualty figures already turning into shipping projections in his head. He had not watched the walls fall, and everything he knew came through Serena, Sarah's clerks, and Balan himself months afterward. Laurian had reconstructed the siege from 3 separate streams of evidence, rather than one polished victory report. The first dispatch arrived from a Kevin family clerk, with soot still smeared along one edge from the fighting around Tulip. Serena sent a second account only after the city was secure enough for her to sit down and write events in careful order. Balan supplied the third version much later, standing inside Greywood's Forge district and describing the same battle from beneath the castle floor. Laurian compared those accounts more than once, especially wherever fear, pride, or distance made witnesses disagree about the exact sequence. He financed proxies to open mines, ports, and trade routes without filling Greywood graves in someone else's war. The unexpected center of the entire campaign was Balan, a dwarf master smith Valerius had refused to release. Laurian had once remarked that a craftsman of Balan's caliber was worth more than 10 gold mines, and Serena remembered the number. The first field dispatch began with disaster beneath Tulip's walls. Valerius still had a third-tier mage on the ramparts, and the man opened by dropping fire into the charging mercenary formation. Fireballs struck hard enough to tear gaps through the line. Then chain lightning jumped across rifles, armor, and bodies packed too closely together. Within 10 minutes, more than 100 hired soldiers were down, and the survivors stopped thinking about promised pay. They turned toward the rear, abandoning ladders and shields while Valerius laughed from the wall at what looked like a failed assault. From his position, the Count had every reason to believe the battle was already decided. Serena understood something he did not. The retreating mercenaries still had to pass through the private guard line she had positioned behind them. Sarah warned her that if the hired troops broke through the rear, the entire assault would collapse with them. Serena answered that they were not going to retreat, because retreat was about to become more expensive than advancing. The first fugitives slammed into drawn swords, but threats from officers meant nothing to men already running from magic. Then 3 musket shots cracked behind the line. 3 deserters dropped before the rest, understood that the weapons pointed at them belonged to their own side. 30 musketeers stood in 2 ranks behind the guards, with the second rank already loaded and ready to fire again. Serena had not placed those shooters there to kill Tulip's soldiers first. Their first job was to make desertion a visibly worse option than the breach ahead. Sarah stepped forward with a megaphone and added the other half of the equation. Compensation for the dead would be doubled, and the first man through the gate would receive 1,000 gold coins and a house in Ragging Tide City. Gold waited in front of them, rifles waited behind them, and the mercenaries chose the direction that still offered a future. Laurian had approved that arrangement before the campaign under the cold accounting label of desertion mitigation. He knew exactly what the phrase meant when he signed it. At that moment, the siege cannon found the gate again. 4 iron balls struck in one volley, tearing down the gate tower and opening a breach more than 10 meters across. The mercenaries surged into the smoke, with their fear redirected into rage and greed. Inside the breach, formations stopped mattering. The press was too tight for lances, shields, or disciplined heavy infantry to work the way they had been trained. Mercenaries fought with sand in visors, daggers through armor joints, ropes at ankle height, and every ugly trick that created space. Tulip's defenders had spent generations perfecting honorable warfare for conditions that no longer exist inside that broken gate. A hallway held until a musket ball found an officer, then the entire defense behind him folded into the next room. 3 stairwells became 3 separate last stands, and none survived long enough for more than a few reloads. By the second hour, regular soldiers were surrendering, instead of dying for positions already surrounded from both sides. Sarah's clerks eventually counted close to 200 prisoners taken during that first push. While the breach consumed everyone's attention, a smaller mercenary team climbed the outer wall under cover of smoke. They reached the ramparts before the defenders understood anyone had come up behind them. The third-tier mage turned too late. A short blade went through him before he could raise another shield, and the staff that had directed Tulip's magical defense fell with him. Without the mage spotting targets, the heavy crossbow crews lost their precision and began wasting bolts into smoke and abandoned ground. The pressure on the attackers dropped almost immediately. Serenas watched through a spyglass from higher ground and recognized the exact moment Tulip's coordinated defense had broken. She lowered the glass, told Sarah the appetizers were finished, and ordered the private army forward. 800 Kevin family soldiers had waited behind the mercenary line, instead of exhausting themselves in the opening charge. Hidden among them were 60 more musketeers trained to load and fire in disciplined pairs. Until then, those guns had mostly enforced order behind the assault. Now they turned toward the enemy. At 30 paces, Laurian's flintlock muskets drove lead through armor that had been designed to stop swords, arrows, and enchanted bolts. Tulip's household knights discovered that expensive plate barely slowed a weapon their military doctrine had never encountered. The effect was immediate and brutal. Survivors began calling the musketeers devils, then abandoned the inner streets rather than test their armor again. 3 hours after the city fighting began, the remaining defense had withdrawn into Valerius's courtyard. The count stayed there with 12 household knights who had sworn to die beside him. Every one of them kept that oath. When Sarah entered the courtyard, the honor guard lay dead, with nearly identical gunshot wounds through armor that had once symbolized elite status. Sarah enjoyed the victory openly, telling Valerius that the Kevin family would own his parliamentary seat, port, treasury, and castle by morning. Valerius never lowered himself to begging. He planted his sword point against the stone and demanded to know who stood behind a salted fish merchant with weapons like these. Sarah could not answer because Laurian's support had always reached him through sealed arrangements and intermediaries. Serena knew exactly who stood behind it. She entered in the black traveling clothes Valerius remembered from a very different negotiation months earlier. Back then, he had blackmailed the Nightingale Merchant Guild out of half a compass distribution contract and treated Serena as someone without leverage. Now she stood in his ruined courtyard, while a musket rested close enough to make the difference obvious. Valerius recognized her, then connected the supply cuts, the Kevin family's sudden wealth, and the northern weapons nobody in the south understood. The trail led to Greywood and finally to Laurian, Bohemia. Serena did not deny it. She only reminded Valerius that the Nightingale Merchant Guild had already warned him how badly it responded to blackmail. Then she moved the musket away from his head. Killing him would have been emotionally satisfying and strategically wasteful. A dead count could not sign the transfer documents Serena needed the next morning. By morning, Valerius signed the transfer. By the time the ink dried, a family that had ruled Tulip for a century had been reduced to a contract in Serena's leather case. The following morning, Sarah looked down over the conquered city and finally understood that the real victor had never crossed the southern border. Laurian did not need personal glory from the campaign. He needed the mines, the ports, the trade routes, and Balan. Sarah offered Serena the northern third of Tulip's remaining territory without demanding payment. The package included 3 major mines, 2 deep-water ports, and a dozen villages along the Blackwater River. Serena immediately understood the gift for what it was. Sarah had seen what Greywood weapons did to Valerius and wanted to buy goodwill before anyone decided Kevin lands should be next. Serena accepted because Laurian had never trained her to reject profitable fear on principle. She only checked whether the Southern Parliament would honor such a large private transfer. Sarah answered that enough Kevin gold would make the Parliament recognize whatever paperwork he placed in front of it. The land alone justified the campaign economically. Yet the part that mattered most to the man they came for was happening below the castle. Balin had spent the battle chained in a dungeon with his daughter and 2 sons, listening to explosions shake dust from the ceiling. His daughter asked whether the castle was being hit by an earthquake. Balin told her it was war, and assumed whoever had attacked Valerius would have little reason to spare prisoners already forgotten underground. Months earlier, the Nightingale Merchant Guild had offered him a way out of Tulip territory. He had refused because leaving under another merchant's protection felt like surrendering a craftsman's dignity. In the dark, he decided that pride had condemned his family with him. His younger son had barely spoken for 3 days, and Balin later admitted that silence frightened him more than the artillery above. He kept counting his children after every blast, the same way he once counted finished blades at the end of a workday. Then, the iron cell door opened from the outside. Greywood soldiers flooded the corridor first, carrying unfamiliar weapons and securing every corner before anyone spoke to the prisoners. Balin heard Serena's voice before his eyes adjusted to the torchlight. His first thought was that the Nightingale Guild must have been captured too. Serena told him nobody had captured her. She had come to take him home. When Balin climbed into the courtyard, the fortress he remembered no longer existed in the same shape. The steel-faced gate was gone. Sections of wall stood open, and prisoners moved past under guard through streets buried in rubble. Among them walked Valerius, stripped of the certainty he had worn when Balan last saw him. Balin asked whether the Nightingale Merchant Guild had truly hired an army simply to destroy the Count. Serena immediately corrected that mistaken assumption. The army had not come south because Laurian cared about Valerius. The entire campaign had been triggered by Balan's imprisonment. Serena reminded him that her brother had called one dwarf master worth more than 10 gold mines. They had tried to buy his contract quietly before any soldier marched. Valerius refused, then locked Balan away, rather than release a resource he wanted to control. Once that happened, the cheapest remaining solution was no longer a purchase. It was changing who owned the territory. Balin stared at the ruined courtyard as the meaning finally reached him. An earldom had fallen because one blacksmith was sitting in chains beneath it. On his home continent, skilled hands were valued, but no lord spent armies to recover a craftsman he had never met. Balin had spent his life being treated like an excellent tool, respected and replaceable at the same time. Greywood had just burned through a fortress to prove that Laurian priced his hands differently. His daughter later told Serena that something returned to her father's in that courtyard, like metal heating after going cold. Balin stood motionless long enough for an escorting soldier to ask whether the family was ready to move. Then he asked for a carriage immediately. He did not want another night in Tulip. Before Serena, his children, and the Greywood escort, Balin swore that if Laurian's foundries were real, he would spend every remaining drop of sweat there. He packed almost nothing from the conquered city. The only possession he refused to leave behind was a small case of hand tools he had protected throughout his captivity. The journey north lasted nearly 6 weeks. Greywood roads cut through the misty mountains along routes Laurian's crews had built years before anyone knew they would carry Balan's family. Balin watched southern vineyards disappear into northern pine country without once asking the driver to slow down. His daughter spent the trip asking questions about Greywood. He could not yet answer. When Laurian received Serena's dispatch, it arrived between grain reports and lumber permits. He could justify the war cleanly on paper. Better alloys, stronger barrels, improved tools, 3 mines, 2 ports, and more territory all produced returns he understood immediately. But Balan's reaction forced another number into the same account. A family that had expected to die underground was now traveling toward a place that had decided the father's hands were worth defending. Laurian did not pretend compassion had been the campaign's original purpose. He had funded force because Valerius would never sell, no matter how high the offer became. Keeping a talented man chained was part of the Count's idea of power, so money alone could never solve the problem. Once negotiation became worthless, Laurian used the next instrument available. The fact that force also saved Balan's children did not need to become fake morality to matter. When Balan finally reached Greywood months later, he went directly to the forge district and asked to inspect the ore feeding Laurian's furnaces. He did not begin with wages or lodging. A craftsman who asks about ore before his contract has already decided where he wants to work. Within a season, the increased furnace output had justified the campaign more than once on Laurian's books. Balan's daughter entered an apprenticeship in the same workshop. His sons found work on road crews connected to the very route that had carried their family north. The ledger closed cleanly. But Laurian kept 2 totals in mind whenever he thought about Tulip. He had gained acreage, mines, ports, and trade access. He had also returned 4 people from a dungeon to a future they had already stopped expecting. Greywood barely had time to absorb that success before danger arrived from the opposite direction. While southern nobles stayed obsessed with the Tulip War, Laurian kept most of his attention on grain reserves, roads, factories, and population growth. He considered other men's wars useful distractions when they kept rival eyes away from his own expansion. One man in the east was not distracted. Zhao Chongxian, prime minister of the Great Shao dynasty, had spent months searching for the runaway princess Li Jinshu. Li Jinshu was living under Laurian's protection inside Greywood. She had arrived with almost nothing, except court knowledge, rice cultivation expertise, and reasons to believe her old government wanted her dead. Laurian had accepted the political cost because sending away someone after offering protection would damage something more valuable than silver. It would tell every future refugee, worker ally, and soldier that Greywood's promises lasted only until they became inconvenient. When news of the first border death reached Li Jinshu, she offered to leave voluntarily rather than let more soldiers die because of her. Laurian refused before she could finish the argument. The choice to shelter her had been his, and an assassin's pressure would not be allowed to renegotiate it for him. He told Li Jinshu that walking into open country would hand Zhao exactly what he wanted without forcing him to pay another price. Inside Greywood, she was under his protection, and Laurian did not let protected assets decide they had become too expensive to keep. Li Jinshu thanked him quietly, even though she clearly did not believe his motives were as impersonal as he claimed. Laurian let her believe whatever helped her sleep. His actual problem was already moving through the misty mountains alone. Wu Ya came from the southern hill tribes of the Great Shao, carrying bone tubes at her belt and the cultivation of a fifth-tier Gu master. She did not need an army because her entire discipline turned living insects into weapons, shields, poison, tracking tools, and control mechanisms. Gu cultivation built power through living organisms raised inside or alongside the practitioner until biology and weaponry became difficult to separate. Laurian's foundries could mass-produce muskets, but he could not mass-produce an answer to something his scholars barely understood. Wu Ya crossed the border on foot through terrain Greywood scouts considered difficult even with maps. The Misty Mountains had never been a perfect wall. Laurian garrisoned important passes and accepted thinner coverage elsewhere because sealing every ridge would consume absurd amounts of money and manpower. Wu Ya found one of those thin stretches by instinct rather than by stealing a defense map. Dell's outpost looked unimportant precisely because Laurian had designed frontier logistics to rely on many cheap nodes instead of a few precious fortresses. Each station carried enough salt, preserved food, tools, and ammunition to keep patrols moving without waiting for wagons from Greywood proper. That redundancy worked against ordinary raiders, because losing one storehouse never crippled an entire district. Against Wu Ya, however, the modest station became an information sample she could study without revealing herself to a larger garrison. For 2 days, she watched from a rocky shelf above the compound where foliage broke her outline against the mountain instead of the sky. Investigators later found signs of a patient observer there, but nothing any sentry had recognized while the observation was actually happening. The recovered logbook was almost insulting in its normality, recording meals, weather, patrol departures, and supply counts without one entry mentioning danger. Laurian hated that absence because it proved a competent enemy could spend 48 hours measuring Greywood, while Greywood noticed nothing in return. That discovery later forced Laurian to randomize watch schedules across the border. He also ordered scouts to watch the heights above their own positions, instead of staring only at roads and ground-level approaches. The outpost itself was modest by Greywood standards. It stocked canned rations, refined salt, steel tools, grain, and ammunition for patrols moving through the border region. Wu Ya examined those supplies before she killed anyone. The stockpile told her more about Greywood than a banner ever could. Canned meat lasted in the field. Refined white salt was cleaner than products reserved for elites in her homeland. And the steel looked unnaturally consistent. Ammunition arrived packed to uniform standards, while shelves and labels made the storehouse operate more like a royal armory than a frontier shed. For the first time, the territory she had dismissed as barbarian looked organized enough to deserve caution. That caution did not save Captain Dell. Captain Dell's service record gave Laurian another reason. The loss stayed with him longer than an ordinary casualty line. The man had spent 3 years on that border without creating enough trouble for senior officers to remember his name regularly. Laurian considered that kind of forgettable competence one of the best qualities a garrison officer could possess. Dell's file also showed 2 winters when he requested extra blankets for his squad before asking for anything that improved his own quarters. Gareth highlighted the detail while compiling the dead captain's history, and Laurian found himself reading farther than he normally read personnel files. Dell had a wife in one of Greywood's resettled villages and 2 children who would now receive every future winter without him. Laurian ordered a payment larger than the normal death benefit and classified it as a garrison operating expense instead of discretionary charity. He knew some future clerk might challenge kindness during a budget squeeze, while almost nobody challenged an expense tied directly to military morale. The label was cynical, but the widow received the silver either way, and Laurian cared more about the transfer than the moral vocabulary around it. That habit defined much of Greywood's government, where compassionate outcomes often survived, because Laurian could defend them with colder equations. Wu Ya used a soul-devouring goo on him. The parasite stripped memories from a living mind, carrying useful fragments back to its master as if pulling thread from a spool. From Dell, Wu Ya learned patrol routes, language, and the name Laurian Bohemia. Wu Ya's soul-devouring goo made Dell's death strategically worse than losing one experienced captain. She did not simply remove a defender. She carried away language, routine, geography, and enough personal memory to understand the organization she had entered. The violation bothered Laurian because walls and passwords meant less when an enemy could interrogate the dead from inside their own minds. Laurian stopped his physicians when their report drifted toward details that could not improve any future defense. He wanted the mechanism, the warning signs, and the useful limits, not suffering recorded merely because somebody had the vocabulary to describe it. She also inherited enough of Dell's view of Greywood to form an opinion of its lord. To her, Laurian looked like a hypocritical barbarian who disguised control and exploitation beneath roads, rations, and public welfare. Laurian found the judgment darkly amusing when Gareth reported it later. He did run Greywood like an enterprise. He simply believed an enterprise that starved, abandoned, or wasted its own people, was badly managed, and eventually destroyed itself. Captain Dell's body was discovered 2 mornings later by a relief patrol. There were no sword cuts or arrow wounds, only strange punctures and the appearance of someone who had been emptied rather than conventionally killed. The storeroom had been searched without being looted. Crates had been opened, examined, then left behind, which worried the investigators more than theft would have. A thief takes what he wants and disappears. Whoever killed Dell had been collecting information. Sergeant Corin led 12 Iron Guard soldiers back toward the outpost to secure the area and investigate. Wu Ya had never truly left the terrain around them. The patrol sent under Sergeant Corin walked into terrain she had already studied far better than they had studied her. Corin's previous record suggested Laurian had not sent fools, which made the destruction of his squad more useful as a warning. She released part of her swarm from the trees before the squad ever saw her clearly. The first sign was sound. A buzzing spread through the canopy so evenly that several soldiers mistook it for weather moving through leaves. Then men lost balance as poison reached them, some dropping weapons because fingers stopped answering before fear had time to form a plan. Others stumbled into companions while vision narrowed, and the formation became a collection of individuals trying to understand their own failing bodies. Corin tried to keep commands moving, but an officer cannot restore a line when half the line can no longer see where it stands. By the time Corin understood the weapon, most of his squad could no longer aim. 10 men died or disappeared in the attack. Only 2 soldiers staggered far enough from the densest swarm to survive. One later remembered crawling through grass while his vision shrank to a single point, still hearing insects after his comrades had stopped answering. The 2 survivors escaped, mostly because they had been positioned behind the densest portion of the attack, instead of because any countermeasure worked. Men lost fingers, balance, and sight, in different order, which suggested future antidotes would need to preserve function rather than simply reduce pain. The fact that both survivors had been near the rear also gave Laurian a crude distance clue about how quickly concentration weakened at the edge of the cloud. He ordered that observation preserved, even though nobody yet knew whether wind, terrain, or Wu Ya's control had created the difference. Neither survivor could describe Wu Ya clearly, which made the attack feel even less like a conventional defeat, and more like a natural disaster with intent. Gareth later admitted that this detail disturbed him more than an enemy standing openly with a sword would have. Greywood knew how to shoot a visible opponent. It did not yet know how to shoot a decision hidden inside a cloud of insects. Laurian reassigned both survivors to lighter duty inside the walls instead of sending them back to the border immediately. He considered recovery part of military readiness, not a sentimental favor. Gareth brought the complete report to Laurian's study and opened with the number Laurian always wanted first. 12 Iron Guard had gone out, 10 were dead, and the 2 survivors could barely speak coherently. The drained captain, the poison, and the controlled swarm all pointed toward an enemy Greywood did not yet understand. Laurian asked whether Gareth believed killings connected to Li Jinshu. Gareth saw no serious alternative. A foreign prime minister did not send an assassin across the mountains to murder random border soldiers for entertainment. The princess was the target, and Greywood was the obstacle. When Gareth admitted the northern courts possessed almost no reliable information about Gu practitioners, Laurian treated that ignorance as a threat by itself. Unknown weapons are dangerous because nobody has procedures ready before the first casualty arrives. One surviving soldier had repeated that the insects moved as though someone was conducting them. That detail confirmed the swarm was not a natural hazard. It had a decision maker. Laurian immediately ordered the Wolf Rider cavalry to track the attacker without attempting a solo engagement. Their job was to find, mark, and hold distance until a force designed for the actual fight could arrive. He also deployed 30 Iron Guard musketeers because disciplined volleys offered better odds than a larger frightened formation. He asked for the fastest unit capable of following a trail through broken country without committing itself to a fight. Wolf Riders fit the requirement because their mounts moved over rough ground faster than ordinary cavalry and could disengage before a slower force became trapped. Laurian's first order forbade pursuit into close combat, even if riders believed Wu Ya looked vulnerable. Their value was contact and location, not a glorious corpse beside an enemy worth more than the whole patrol. The Iron Guard Musket Company would follow as the actual striking arm once the riders established where she had gone. Gareth wrote while Laurian dictated, turning spoken intent into the short language soldiers needed when decisions had to survive a messenger ride. Laurian stopped him on the phrase telling the riders simply to hold distance after contact. That wording still left room for an ambitious captain to believe. Holding position mattered more than living through an unsupported attack. He changed the order, so withdrawal became mandatory if Wu Ya closed without musket support. Losing the trail for one day was cheaper than losing experienced riders because someone wanted his report to sound courageous. The correction took seconds. But Laurian considered those seconds more useful than speeches about honor delivered after preventable funerals. Laurian remained in his study, returning to grain shipments, while other people carried his decision toward the border. While the orders moved toward the stables, he returned to ordinary correspondence because there was nothing useful he could personally add from his study. The distance between command and violence never stopped feeling strange, even when Laurian preferred it strategically. Men would soon be moving through dangerous country because of ink still drying on paper beside his grain accounts. The Wolf Riders found Wu Ya sooner than Laurian expected, partly because her recent exertion had limited whatever concealment she normally used. They shadowed her from broken hills into open savanna, where tall grass could hide a crouching person, but not a standing one. The riders resisted the easy mistake of assuming open ground made the target easy simply because they could finally see her. Wu Ya walked without hurry, as if pursuit confirmed something she had already calculated rather than forcing a change in her plan. That calm kept the riders from trying to steal a victory before the musketeers arrived. A runner went back for the musket company. For a brief stretch, the operation looked almost clean. The musket company marched in column, then deployed with the drilled precision Laurian had demanded through 3 seasons of repetitive training. His doctrine valued synchronized fire over individual marksmanship because 30 ordinary shooters acting together created results no single hero could guarantee. Breaking formation to chase personal glory had been punished in exercises long before anybody knew a Gu master would test the rule. On the savannah, that boring discipline became the reason the company survived long enough to learn anything useful at all. Even the moment of hesitation before the first volley exposed a weakness Laurian later addressed in debriefing. Several soldiers saw a slight woman with empty hands and instinctively judged the amount of firepower aimed at her as excessive. The Wolf Riders recognized the movement toward her belt first and signaled that the target was already acting. Only then did the company fire, teaching every survivor that visual harmlessness meant nothing against an opponent whose weapons lived inside bone tubes and flesh. The first volley fired in near unison. By every rule those soldiers understood, the engagement should have ended there. The first volley did not finish her. A tarnished metallic shell flashed around Wu Ya at the final instant, catching 30 musket balls before they reached her body. The shield cracked across its surface like broken glass, but it held long enough to leave her staggering instead of dead. For soldiers trained to trust volley fire, watching one person survive that impact was the first warning that ordinary battlefield assumptions no longer applied. The company reloaded without breaking formation in under a minute, letting drilled repetition carry their hands while surprise occupied the mind. One front-rank soldier remembered the first volley striking Wu Ya's shield as a single flat impact rather than 3 separate hits. A second volley struck with grenades thrown from the flanks. This time, fragmentation opened real wounds, and witnesses saw blood through the smoke as the weakened shield failed to absorb everything. Reloading under that shock mattered as much as the volley itself, because panic during the long muzzle-loading sequence would have dissolved the formation. The men repeated motions drilled hundreds of times, hands moving through powder, ball, ramrod, and priming while smoke still hid the target. Fragmentation cut through where direct shot had struggled, giving Laurian the first concrete evidence that Gu defenses possess different limits against different threats. That distinction later shaped experiments more usefully than the simple statement that Wu Ya was strong. The officers briefly believed persistence had solved the problem. Their commander was less certain, because an enemy still standing after 2 volleys and grenades had probably not revealed her worst weapon yet. Several witnesses felt a low vibration through the ground before the swarm reached the ranks, though investigators could not determine whether memory sharpened that detail afterward. Laurian kept the testimony marked as uncertain instead of discarding it, because an unreliable early warning was still worth testing before the next encounter. Wu Ya released the blood fiend goo. The warning proved correct when the blood fiend swarm attacked people instead of armor. A red living swarm crossed the remaining distance and reached soldiers faster than the company could reorganize around a new kind of threat. The first visible change was in their eyes. A dozen Iron Guard lost normal expression and began moving with the unnatural precision of puppets, following commands from somewhere else. Then they turned muskets and blades on the men who had trained beside them for years. Company formation collapsed from the inside. Untouched soldiers hesitated because the uniforms in front of them still belonged to friends, and that hesitation gave the puppets time to kill. Others fired immediately and survived by doing something they would remember long after the physical wounds closed. One survivor called a tentmate's name twice before shooting him because nothing human answered from the face behind the raised musket. Another puppeted soldier kept advancing through wounds that should have forced any conscious man to stop, finally collapsing only from blood loss. Laurian's entire firearm doctrine assumed each shooter remained a reliable node inside a disciplined line. Wu Ya attacked that assumption by changing the loyalty of the node rather than defeating the weapon it carried. A musket in a controlled soldier's hands remained mechanically perfect while becoming a threat aimed inward. The surviving company learned that friendly uniforms could no longer serve as automatic proof of friendly intent once the insects reached exposed skin. That lesson was psychologically expensive because battlefield trust normally depends on not questioning the person protecting your blind side. Some soldiers survived by firing at men they loved before those men could complete the turn against them. Others delayed for one name, one shout, or one moment of recognition and paid for that hesitation with blood. When Laurian later read those testimonies, he refused to reduce them to a lesson about faster reactions alone. A doctrine that demanded instant killing of possibly controlled comrades needed medical evidence, protective equipment, and recognition procedures before it became policy. Later examinations found no obvious injury that explained the behavior beyond faint insect bites around exposed skin. He ordered physicians to study the bite marks and determine which exposed areas the swarm had used most often. Collars, cuffs, gloves, and sealed seams were cheap experiments compared with another company vulnerabilities through casualties. The surviving insect husks went into sealed glass under controlled access near the infirmary, where specialists studied structure, venom, and possible command mechanisms. No one promised the work would produce an answer quickly, and Laurian ordered it anyway. Slow knowledge accumulated before the next crisis was still better than brilliant improvisation. After another squad was already dead. By the time the close fighting ended, the neat musket formation that had marched onto the savannah barely existed. Dead soldiers lay beside comrades they had been forced to kill, while the wounded no longer knew which movement around them could be trusted. One mortally wounded puppet remained standing long enough to deliver Wu Ya's message. His voice sounded flat and wrong, as though the words were being pushed through him, rather than spoken by him. The demand itself was brutally simple. The mortally wounded puppet who delivered Wu Ya's demand should have collapsed before he spoke, according to the company's surgeon. Greywood would surrender Li Jinshu, or Wu Ya would keep bleeding the North One outpost. One patrol, and one company at a time. The puppet collapsed as soon as the message was finished. Laurian understood the performance as negotiation through terror rather than random cruelty. Wu Ya wanted every survivor carrying home proof that she could reach into Greywood's own ranks and turn soldiers against each other. Laurian refused to answer fear with surrender. He intended to answer with procedures, better equipment, more research, and enough firepower to make the next demonstration cost Wu Ya far more. During the confusion, the wounded Goo Master withdrew toward the tree line. Wolf riders chased, and their lead animal held Wu Ya's scent clean for nearly a mile. Then every tracking cue vanished together. A loss the lead rider compared to a rope being cut instead of a trail fading. Later evidence suggested Wu Ya used another goo specifically to erase or mask scent, defeating animals bred for tracking as if someone had cut a rope. The riders searched for most of the day and found only broken grass and discarded insect husks. Wu Ya escaped, but she escaped wounded, and knowing Greywood had forced her to spend techniques she would rather have kept hidden. The lead rider admitted in writing that scent alone was no longer enough against a target like her. Laurian respected the admission and ordered Gareth to investigate alchemical, herbal, and visual tracking methods that could supplement the wolves. When the full casualty report arrived, Laurian read it longer than most documents on his desk. Captain Dell was dead. Sergeant Corin's squad had been shattered, and more Iron Guard had died on the savannah, some by friendly weapons. Laurian wrote the names into his private register of the fallen himself. He used the same steady hand he used for grain tallies, because numbers were how he prevented grief from paralyzing the decisions that came next. Handing Li Jinshu over never became a serious option. A lord who surrendered someone under his protection, the moment an enemy applied pain, would teach every future rival that threats worked. He would also teach his own soldiers and civilians that Greywood's promises had expiration dates. Laurian considered that long-term damage more dangerous than Wu Ya's immediate demand. He doubled security across the Misty Mountains outposts, increased grenade and ammunition production, and ordered every post reviewed for blind approaches and weak escape routes. Li Jinshu's own security tightened as well, not because secrecy would make her invisible, but because protection had to remain real after it became expensive. Laurian visited the wounded when they returned to Greywood, instead of reading their condition only through medical reports. He walked rows of beds without offering empty speeches to men who had watched their friends become weapons. One bandaged soldier asked whether Wu Ya would return. Laurian told him the truth that he did not know, but Greywood would be preparing as though she would. Another survivor could not meet Laurian's eyes, and Laurian did not force conversation onto someone still carrying the attack inside his head. The physicians received orders to spare no expense, restoring the wounded as completely as Greywood's medicine allowed. Laurian also visited the surviving soldiers. Once they reached Greywood's infirmary, where vinegar, boiled linen, and medicine replaced the smell of powder. He ordered better bread, wine where physicians allowed it, and other small comforts added to normal recovery rations for the entire ward. The expense was tiny beside replacing trained soldiers, but Laurian noticed he stayed in the infirmary longer than that calculation required. Laurian called it an investment in future readiness, because that language helped him make the decision cleanly. Underneath the accounting, he simply did not want preventable losses repeated, because he had been too cheap to learn from the first ones. That evening, new border procedures began accumulating on Gareth's desk. Watch schedules became less predictable. Storeroom security tightened, support response time shortened, and physicians began compiling everything known about insect-borne poisons. Laurian also sent quiet inquiries through Southern trade contacts about other goose practitioners operating outside their homeland. The answers were frustratingly thin, so Laurian ordered scholars to build a permanent goo file, even if its first pages contained more uncertainty than facts. An empty doctrine would not protect the next patrol, but a growing record meant Greywood would never again begin from complete ignorance. Zhao Chongxian's choice of one grandmaster instead of an army also taught Laurian something about the enemy behind the assassin. The Prime Minister respected Greywood enough to avoid an invasion that would announce itself, consume treasure, and invite neighboring powers to react. A single elite operative was cheaper, deniable, and patient, which meant Laurian had to defend against quiet pressure rather than only visible campaigns. He treated that realization as the beginning of a longer contest rather than the conclusion of one failed assassination attempt. Wu Ya had treated failure as information and withdrawn to recalculate. Laurian recognized the habit because it was exactly what he did after a production mistake, a military loss, or a failed investment. The next confrontation would be an arms race between two people who both learned faster after being hurt. The next consolidated battle report removed any temptation. Laurian had to treat the savannah as an isolated tactical embarrassment. Supply point 13 was gone. 16 musketeers were listed among the dead, and 8 surviving soldiers had injuries that would permanently change how they worked. Across the sequence, 34 names had moved from payroll to casualty records, while Wu Ya remained capable of choosing when the next engagement began. One witness claimed the firing line had forced her through repeated walls of powder smoke and explosive pressure before she finally disengaged. That failure disturbed Laurian more than the number, because gunpowder had been the foundation of his belief that organized industry could equalize personal power. For the first time, a single individual had made that assumption look dangerously incomplete. Sylvie stood in the study wearing enchanted armor and carrying the strength of a 4th-tier fighter. Even she would not casually promise she could defeat Wu Ya in open ground. Li Jinshu sat nearby twisting a handkerchief between her fingers, while Han Yong waited beside her with the calm of someone who understood the threat better. Li Jinshu again offered to leave Greywood rather than keep causing casualties. Laurian cut the offer off. He reminded her that she had brought useful rice knowledge, strong accounting skills, and value to a territory that had already accepted responsibility for her safety. More importantly, Greywood did not hand away people wearing its protection simply because an enemy had made them costly. Laurian then demanded a real assessment from Han Yong. How many soldiers would it actually take to kill a prepared 5th-tier Goo Master? Han did not flatter him with a comfortable answer. 30 musketeers had never been enough. A fifth-tier goo master in the East was considered a grandmaster, capable of using cultivated organisms to create shields, numb pain, poison enemies, and keep damaged organs functioning. That meant damaging Wu Ya once did not guarantee the damage stayed decisive long enough for the next shot to matter. A shield organism could buy a moment, another creature could reduce pain, and another could keep the body functioning after ordinary soldiers would collapse. Laurian found the arrangement disturbing because the weapon and the soldier were no longer cleanly separable categories. To corner someone like Wu Ya safely, Han estimated Laurian would need roughly 1,000 musketeers firing in staggered ranks. The goal would be continuous pressure, denying her the time needed to recover shields or deploy more complex goo techniques. After the barrage exhausted her defenses, a comparable fighter, such as Sylvie, would still need to close and finish the engagement quickly. Miss one part of that sequence, and Wu Ya could disappear again. Han added a worse strategic possibility. A fifth-tier goo master left free for months could poison wells, contaminate granaries, or turn a town into a plague site before anyone identified the source. That warning converted Wu Ya from an assassin problem into a population-level threat. Laurian understood the math immediately and hated it. Greywood could not field 1,000 elite musketeers without stripping other garrisons and exposing the rest of the territory. More barrels alone would not solve the problem either, because ammunition production, drill time, powder quality, officers, and supply carts all had to scale together. Production was already strained, with only a few dozen working muskets available locally and another detachment serving Serena in the south. Balin's future improvements might change the scale, but those improvements did not exist yet. Laurian briefly compared Wu Ya to the strategic superhumans of his old world's fiction and military thinking, rare individuals powerful enough to shape wars by presence alone. He almost admired Zhao Chongxian for sending such an expensive asset after one fugitive princess. A strategist who wanted a loose thread gone had chosen overwhelming force instead of gambling on a cheaper solution. Laurian pictured dead wells and poisoned food moving through neighborhoods faster than clerks could identify a pattern. That scenario forced him to classify Wu Ya as an infrastructure threat, not simply the foreign assassin attached to Li Jinshu's name. Han Yang then corrected Laurian's understanding of the Eastern power ceiling. Fifth tier was not the top of the world. It was only the highest level most ordinary people ever saw. Beyond it were beings Eastern traditions called Earth of Mortals or martial gods. Their rumored homeland was known as the Land of Immortals. Laurian initially treated the words as titles inflated by religion or propaganda. Han insisted the descriptions were literal enough to matter. Such beings could travel impossible distances, fly, summon storms, and use personal power on a scale ordinary armies could not meaningfully answer. He cited old imperial records describing a swordsman splitting a flooding river with one strike and destroying an entire rebel force in the riverbed. Laurian asked whether that story was folklore. Han said the event appeared in multiple provincial chronicles and the imperial archive, written by sources separated enough to make simple copying unlikely. That transformed a legend into a data point Laurian could not ignore. The idea attacked the hidden assumption beneath every Greywood defense plan, that every enemy still had to cross ground before reaching the people Laurian protected. A flying opponent capable of ignoring walls converted expensive fortifications into scenery, unless Greywood eventually developed range, detection, and response speed to match. For a few minutes, Laurian saw the factory smoke outside his window as evidence of how far behind he still was, instead of how far Greywood had already come. Every defense projection he had built, assumed fifth tier, represented the worst individual threat Greywood might eventually face. In one conversation, that ceiling disappeared. Laurian looked from the study window toward Greywood's factory chimneys and saw them differently. They were no longer proof that industry had already solved this world's military problem. They were the beginning of an escalation he had underestimated. If flintlocks could not kill beings above fifth tier, Laurian's memory still contained machine guns, heavy artillery, tanks, aircraft, and missiles. None of those weapons existed in Greywood, and Laurian refused to pretend remembering a machine was the same as being able to manufacture it. But learning the real ceiling changed the direction of every long-term industrial decision. Then his thinking shifted from embarrassment to requirements. A flintlock was not technology's final answer, any more than a bronze spear had been metallurgy's final answer. Machine guns existed in his memory as proof that sustained fire could be mechanized far beyond rotating ranks of human reloaders. Heavy artillery offered another direction by increasing the energy delivered before a superhuman opponent entered personal striking distance. Aircraft mattered because control of the sky could no longer be treated as fantasy. Once people capable of flight existed somewhere in the same world. Laurian even allowed himself to remember tanks and long-range missiles, then stopped before imagination turned into fake production schedules. Knowing a machine conceptually did not create precision tools, fuel alloys, chemistry, or engineers able to reproduce it. The correct response was not promising impossible weapons next year. It was building the industrial branches that made those weapons less impossible every year afterward. At almost the same moment, the system that followed Greywood's growth changed. The territory had crossed 150,000 registered residents. A system notice classified Greywood as a medium-sized town and unlocked a new technology tree achievement function. Each achievement would release a matching blueprint once its requirement was completed. For Laurian, that was the first mechanism capable of turning his old world knowledge into verified industrial designs instead of unreliable memory alone. When the others left, he opened the new panel in silence. The display spread like a connected star chart, with population, infrastructure, and production milestones forming separate technological branches. The new interface organized progress into achievements tied to measurable civil and industrial conditions rather than vague personal cultivation milestones. Laurian liked the structure immediately, because a locked requirement with a defined reward was simply another contract he could plan around. The first major achievement was called Dawn of the Consumer Era. It required a shopping mall covering more than 10,000 square meters. The reward was the complete formula for Coca-Cola and blueprints for a basic soft drink bottling line. The drink itself amused Laurian less than the machinery behind it. A bottling line meant standardized glass, reliable ceilings, pressure control, and manufacturing methods with uses far beyond sweet water. He immediately imagined merchants, distribution routes, and an outer city location with enough traffic to justify the building. A mall also gave ordinary families an indoor public space, but Laurian filed that benefit behind the production possibilities, rather than turning it into a speech. Pressure control could support other liquids and chemical processes, while consistent glass containers improved storage far outside the beverage trade. The mall itself also trained construction crews to build large indoor commercial spaces using reinforced materials and coordinated logistics. Laurian already knew where traffic in the outer city justified the project, which turned the achievement from aspirations into capital scheduling. The next achievement was continuation of life. Greywood's birth rate needed to reach 20%, while current progress sat around 17%. The reward was a disposable diaper production line, using highly absorbent material. Laurian saw the domestic item as infrastructure. Cleaner infants meant fewer infections, better survival, less time spent washing cloth, and more household labor available for paid work. He began considering newborn subsidies and stronger midwife coverage as the fastest ethical way to close the remaining birth rate gap. Disposable diapers would reduce exposure to soiled cloth and free hours of domestic washing that currently consumed labor every day. Laurian's mind automatically translated healthier infants into future population, but he could no longer pretend the individual children were meaningless before adulthood. Years of running Greywood had taught him that survival statistics were built from particular households receiving help, before one ordinary infection became irreversible. The third achievement mattered even more that night. Cornerstone of the firearms age required Greywood to produce and field 100 standard muskets. Laurian had already fielded 61. Completing the requirement would unlock a breech-loading, double-barreled shotgun and paper cartridge production. The improvement attacked the weakness Wu Ya had just demonstrated. Muzzle-loading weapons spent too much time between shots, while a breech system could dramatically increase the rate of fire without requiring superhuman shooters. 39 more muskets now stood between Laurian and a weapon he wanted immediately. He ordered the armory toward double shifts, rather than waiting for the achievement to arrive naturally. Other branches promised basic antibiotic cultivation after a citywide sewage system and vulcanized rubber after building a real fire brigade. The sewage achievement interested his physicians more than his soldiers, since the reward pointed toward cultivating basic antibiotics. Laurian understood enough from his old life to know that medicine capable of treating infection could save more citizens across decades than spectacular weapons saved in one battle. A proper sewer network would also reduce disease before the reward ever appeared, making the requirement itself economically useful rather than arbitrary system busywork. The fire brigade branch offered vulcanized rubber, which Laurian immediately connected to seals, hoses, machine belts, gaskets, and equipment that currently depended on leather. Cold weather cracked those leather components at exactly the wrong time, turning a material science reward into improved reliability across workshops and emergency services. The pattern convinced Laurian that the technology tree rewarded societies for becoming capable of using the technologies it released. A territory with sewage could support antibiotics responsibly, and a territory with a fire brigade had practical reasons to understand durable, flexible materials. The achievements were not gifts disconnected from development. They were accelerators waiting behind infrastructure Greywood already needed. The pattern mattered more than any single reward. Greywood could now convert civil development into industrial technology through fixed, verifiable requirements. Laurian no longer had to depend entirely on fragments remembered from another world and craftsmen guessing their way toward solutions. The system had finally given him a repeatable ladder. That realization also prevented Laurian from trying to chase every icon at once. Construction crews, copper, iron, glass, skilled labor, and administrative attention remained finite, even when the system displayed dozens of tempting rewards. He prioritized branches that reinforced current vulnerabilities and allowed slower civilian projects to continue without cannibalizing every military resource. The real immediate problem was time. A blueprint still required materials, machine tools, trained workers, and months of production before it became hardware sitting in a soldier's hands. Wu Ya remained somewhere in the Misty Mountains and had no reason to respect Laurian's development schedule. Laurian needed a temporary answer that did not waste his own trained population while buying enough time for industry to catch up. He summoned Ball, his old butler, and stood with him over a map of the Northern Territory. The mountains favored Wu Ya. Dense fog, closed canopy, narrow trails, and broken visibility destroyed the formation discipline that made Iron Guard musketeers effective. Sending valuable troops into that forest would convert trained soldiers into isolated targets. A firing line needed sight spacing, coordinated reloads, and officers able to see what neighboring soldiers were doing. Inside dense mountain woods, those advantages collapsed into single-file movement, blocked trajectories, and grenades that could rebound from branches toward friendly troops. 1,000 elite musketeers were valuable on open ground, and absurdly wasteful as individual searchers crawling through fog between trees. Laurian wanted bodies that could search dangerous ground without damaging his registered population if they died. Ball understood before the explanation finished. The answer was expendable northern mercenaries. Over the previous 6 months, Greywood's reliable payments had attracted wandering blades, disgraced knights, fugitives, and adventurers from across the north. Laurian had used them for monster clearing, escort work, rumor spreading, and jobs too risky to justify using citizens or regular troops. The Mercenary Guild had become infrastructure without most of its members realizing it. They trusted Greywood because completed contracts were paid in full, instead of becoming invitations for a noble to renegotiate afterward. That reputation was now a weapon Laurian could spend. Outlaws who expected nobles to cheat them learned that a Greywood clerk paid the posted amount after proof was verified. That predictability created something Laurian valued more than goodwill credit. Once outsiders believed his promises had face value, he could mobilize them with a notice instead of building another permanent army. None of those mercenaries counted toward the system's registered population. Laurian therefore viewed them with a colder standard than the workers and soldiers whose lives directly formed Greywood's foundation. He told Ball to post a graduated bounty throughout the north. A verified clue about a dark-skinned Eastern woman wearing silver jewelry would earn 100 silver coins. A precise location that guided Greywood forces directly to her would earn 1,000 silver. A team that engaged Wu Ya and held her in place long enough for musketeers to arrive would earn 3,000 silver. If anyone somehow killed or captured her, Laurian offered a manor inside Greywood's inner city and wealth beyond ordinary mercenary expectations. Ball knew the final prize was almost certainly uncollectible. Its purpose was to make every desperate hunter imagine being the impossible exception. Laurian also ordered discounted crossbows and antidote supplies offered to participants. Mercenaries who survived longer were more useful as moving sensors than fools who died before locating anything. 2 weeks later, Greywood's new bounty hall was packed before the government official even reached the mission board. The 3-story building itself projected permanence through stone floors, polished surfaces, and enchanted lighting that made Greywood's wealth difficult to dismiss. The bounty hall itself reinforced the credibility of the promise. Before an official read a single number, polished stone, enchanted chandeliers, armed guards, printed maps, and organized clerks told wandering mercenaries that Greywood expected to be paying contracts years from now. That permanence mattered to men accustomed to employers disappearing, changing terms, or pretending a successful outlaw had never been hired. Rumors had already spread about the destroyed supply point, dead iron guard, and an Eastern woman using poison and insects. Some men treated the stories as tavern exaggeration. Others noticed the details were too specific to ignore. 4 armed guards escorted the official to the center of the hall, where he nailed Laurian's sealed notice onto the dangerous workboard. He described the target clearly enough to identify her, and warned that she was extremely lethal. He did not announce that she was a 5th-tier grandmaster. Laurian wanted search volume, and terrifying the entire labor pool into staying home would defeat the plan before it started. For a moment, the hall became silent enough to hear the fire in the lamps. Then greed finally overwhelmed every remaining caution. The crowd's reaction to the first 100 silver offer confirmed Laurian had priced curiosity high enough to overcome common sense. By the time the manor was announced, caution had become a problem for individual mercenaries rather than a problem for the operation as a whole. Crews rushed toward maps because each believed some other fool might accidentally become rich first. Mercenary groups shoved toward the board, arguing over routes, intelligence packets, antidotes, and who would register first. The Blood Axes claimed a search zone, while the Shadow Blades demanded every available toxicology note before entering the mountains. Greywood clerks handed out printed maps and intelligence booklets as fast as the crowd could take them. The same participants could buy surplus military crossbows and Cecilia's antidote herbs at reduced prices. Laurian considered even that a useful secondary transaction, because the search operation helped clear aging inventory while keeping the hunters better equipped. By late afternoon, hundreds of mercenaries were streaming through Greywood's gates toward the misty mountains. Many had not reached even first-tier strength. None understood the full gap between themselves and the woman they were being paid to find. Laurian watched the departure from his mansion with black tea in hand, and almost no pity for the people choosing the risk. They were not registered citizens, had not been conscripted, and had accepted the published danger in exchange for money. To him, they were cheap detection units motivated by greed rather than salaries, pensions, or loyalty. The plan required only one thing from them: scatter through enough forest, force Wu Ya to react somewhere, and survive long enough for one credible sighting to reach a waiting rider. Greywood already had relay riders positioned near northern checkpoints, so musketeers could move as soon as a location became solid. The operation would succeed only if the time between sighting and organized response stayed shorter than Wu Ya's ability to vanish again. Laurian did not need them to understand Wu Ya's true rank. He needed enough independent search paths, crossing the mountains that staying completely unseen became more expensive for her with every passing hour. Relay riders waiting behind the search zone completed the design by connecting amateur discovery to professional firepower. A sighting that took a day to reach Greywood was almost worthless against an assassin capable of erasing her trail in minutes. A sighting relayed immediately could turn greed in the forest into muskets moving. Before Wu Ya realized one frightened survivor had escaped her notice, Laurian understood that a 5th-tier fighter could dominate individuals. He wanted to test whether individual talent could stay invisible forever against an organization that kept producing more searchers, more maps, and more pressure. The mercenaries were the immediate answer. The technology tree was the long answer. Together, they represented Laurian's preferred way of fighting the impossible. Buy time cheaply, then use that time to manufacture a better future. Deep inside the misty mountains, Wu Ya had already found a hollow where roots twisted together beneath a canopy dense enough to erase moonlight. She was wounded, short on resources, and furious about how much power she had spent against soldiers far below her rank. The earlier musket volleys had cracked her ironclad goo badly enough that quick recovery was impossible. Grenades had forced her to burn additional organisms and internal energy simply to stay alive long enough to escape. Her most painful expense was the blood fiend goo colony, cultivated for nearly a year through methods no ordinary soldier wanted described in detail. She had spent that precious swarm controlling low-rank musketeers instead of preserving it for a target worthy of its cost. For someone as calculating as Wu Ya, surviving with a terrible exchange rate did not feel like victory. She expected Laurian to understand the message and surrender Li Jinshu before another company had to die. That assumption came from a lifetime among nobles who treated personal danger as the only political language that mattered. Most lords would rather sacrifice a guest than sleep knowing a 5th-tier assassin could enter their bedroom before dawn. Laurian was not most lords. Nearby animal life became material for recovery, including a huge armored beast later found hollowed by whatever goo she had used to restore herself. Even that food was insufficient to replace rare organisms cultivated through methods the mountain could not reproduce quickly. Instead, torchlight began multiplying through the forest, until the darkness itself looked crowded. At first, Wu Ya believed the lights belonged to a poorly organized army, sent by someone who still did not understand fifth-tier power. The truth was stranger, because most of the people approaching her had no common commander uniform or loyalty beyond a posted reward. Laurian's credit turned hundreds of selfish motives into overlapping search coverage without requiring those people to trust each other personally. Among the hunters was Varn, a half-elf tracker known across the north for reading forests with almost unnatural patience. He stopped his group roughly 500 meters from Wu Ya's hollow when the surrounding silence became wrong. The misty mountains were never truly quiet at night. Insects, scavengers, wind, and small animals always created a background rhythm, yet this patch of forest seemed emptied of life. Varn crouched, lifted dead leaves, and caught a faint rotten scent that did not match ordinary decay. Something had stripped the immediate area of crawling life. The bounty description mentioned an Eastern woman associated with unnatural insects, and Varn finally treated the silence itself as a location marker. His companions wanted to rush forward before another group stole the reward. Varn reminded them that Greywood paid for results, not bravery performed in front of corpses. A dead hunter could not collect 3,000 silver or argue over credit afterward. Instead of charging, he used an old night owl signal to call nearby mercenary groups into the same area. Rivals converged from multiple search lines, suspicious of each other, but even more interested in sharing a reward large enough to divide. Varn explained the arithmetic clearly. If they surrounded one target together, no single team needed to gamble everything on the first attack. The bounty structure did exactly what Laurian had intended. A payment ladder that rewarded information, engagement, and capture made cooperation more profitable than stabbing competitors over the first clue. Soon men who had been racing each other through the mountains were sharing water, comparing tracks, and assigning sections of a perimeter. A dwarven axeman and a disgraced human knight ended up guarding the same flank without caring enough to exchange names. Money created the reason to cooperate. Survival instincts supplied the discipline Laurian had never paid for directly. Some bands contributed shields, others crossbows, others tracking knowledge, and the mixed ring became stronger, precisely because nobody had planned it centrally. Varn divided ground instead of ranks, giving each team an area to watch so gaps became obvious and duplicated effort shrank. More than 300 mercenaries eventually formed a rough ring around the hollow. Tower shields moved to the front, crossbows settled behind them, and torchlight revealed the drained carcass of a huge armored beast near Wu Ya's position. The corpse should have been warning enough. Instead, most men saw proof that something valuable was close. Wu Ya let them compress the ring before responding. The canopy began rustling above them, with a dry sound like wind running through dead leaves. A red cloud dropped over the front ranks, thick enough to swallow torchlight. Crossbowmen fired into it blindly. The bolts disappeared without producing a human scream. The cloud was not smoke. It was a living mass of blood-fiend goo. Men touched by the swarm did not simply fall. Their skin changed color, their eyes rolled white, and black fluid appeared at their mouths before they turned weapons on the people beside them. One mercenary shouted his brother's name a fractions of a second before the brother's blade cut him down. Another group broke apart when three friends suddenly attacked from inside their own shield wall. Within minutes, more than 60 bodies covered the ground, and the ring had become a chaotic fight between mercenaries and their controlled companions. The most horrifying part was how quickly the puppetry ended when the insects released someone. Survivors dropped back into themselves and found blood on their own hands before they understood what they had done. Several of those people later abandoned mercenary work entirely after collecting whatever Greywood owed them. Wu Ya expected the remaining hunters to break. A force losing roughly a fifth of its number without meaningfully touching her should have scattered by every experience she carried from the east. The survivors retreated about 100 meters, but they did not leave. Some wanted to send a runner, claim the location reward, and let the Iron Guard finish the job. Others wanted to disappear into the night before Wu Ya released another swarm. Varn rejected both plans without hesitation. By the time soldiers arrived, Wu Ya could erase her trail again, and every death already paid for that night would have purchased nothing. The argument was not heroic. It was personal debt mixed with greed. Men stared back at dead friends and began treating the unpaid bounty like money already owed to them. Command settled around Varn because he was the person still thinking while everyone else was deciding whether to run. He replayed the attack and noticed the red cloud had moved like insects rather than ordinary poison mist. That observation produced the simplest possible countermeasure. Even cultivated insects still burned. One scarred mercenary remembered the exact bounty wording and pointed out that Laurian had prohibited neither fire nor destruction of the forest. Older hunters warned that the autumn undergrowth was dry enough to turn one torch into a disaster. Varn answered with a gambler's logic that made sense to frighten men. Wu Ya was a certain threat directly in front of them. A wildfire was only a possible disaster they might survive. Varn then focused on the only property of the swarm he could reason about, without understanding goo cultivation. The organisms had wings, bodies, and enough physical substance to block torchlight. Whatever mystical control animated them, they still occupied air and reacted to heat like living things. The bounty notice restricted the target and payment conditions, not what happened to the surrounding forest. Someone pointed out that this legal distinction would mean nothing if the flames escaped their control. The group chose the possibility. Kerosene lamps shattered against dead leaves. Liquor followed the kerosene, then came torches. The forest ignited faster than anyone standing there truly expected. Flame ran through dry litter, climbed brush, and found low branches before the first line of men had fully retreated. Wu Ya's remaining low-order goo began dying from heat even when crossbow bolts had failed to stop them. Her battlefield advantage turned into a liability, because every living organism she depended on now occupied the same burning ecosystem. Cold steel could be blocked. Gunfire could be absorbed at terrible cost. A forest fire simply kept applying heat to everything until there was no safe position left to defend. Wu Ya abandoned the hollow and disappeared before the flames reached her perch. At roughly that moment, Laurian stopped, depending on secondhand reports. From the highest terrace of his mansion, he saw the northern horizon turn red. The textile mill and foundry below him were dark for the night, making the distant glow impossible to mistake for ordinary industrial fire. Smoke climbed high enough to erase familiar stars. Laurian knew his own law clearly. Deliberate arson in that forest carried a severe sense because the misty mountains were filled with dry fuel and dangerous wildlife. His first anger at the mercenaries lasted only until the next consequence became obvious. The fire itself was not the largest threat. Everything living ahead of the flame would flee away from heat, and the easiest escape route pointed toward Greywood's farms and outer works. A beast tide could flatten fields, break light factory walls, and kill civilians without any creature needing to attack intentionally. Sylvie joined Laurian on the terrace and initially observed that fire was a logical way to drive back insects. Laurian forced her to look beyond the immediate tactic. The driest autumn in years had left deep leaf litter across the mountains, turning the entire forest into connected fuel. Tens of thousands of beasts lived inside that fuel. Once panic moved them toward the plains, property lines and defensive plans would mean nothing. Greywood's population, grain, factories, and labor force all sat in the path of a secondary disaster created by Laurian's own bounty operation. That realization made the wildfire more dangerous to him than Wu Ya had been during the search. Laurian ordered the highest alarm in the inner city. Every available iron guard, off-duty security officer, able worker, and orc construction crew was called toward the north gate. He wanted 20,000 people mobilized within half an hour, with axes, shovels, and pickaxes distributed on arrival. Sylvie offered to organize bucket lines and attack the flames directly. Laurian rejected that approach without hesitation. A fire that size would consume hand-carried water faster than humans could move it. Greywood needed containment rather than a dramatic but useless attempt to extinguish the whole mountain. Laurian studied the wind and marked a line roughly 2 kilometers ahead of the projected fire front. He ordered a fire break more than 20 meters wide, stripped to wet soil, stone, and anything else that could not carry flame forward. The workforce would operate in 3 main lines. Axe crews removed standing trees and brush. Shovel crews turned soil and pulled roots capable of smoldering beneath the surface. Hauling teams dragged cut timber far from the break, instead of stacking new fuel beside the barrier. Laurian ordered wider clearing around dry stream beds and irregular ground where flame could jump unpredictably. He also held roughly 2,000 workers in reserve near the north gate in case the wind opened a second front. Sylvie asked whether the reserve should carry weapons or digging tools. Laurian told her to prepare both. The approaching problem included fire, panicked beasts, and the possibility that Wu Ya might appear wherever Greywood became distracted. Sylvie left before the final order had fully left Laurian's mouth. From the terrace, he watched runners move toward barracks and work camps while torch columns formed below. Orc quarry crews lined up beside guards without anyone wasting time separating people by status. Residents came into streets and onto balconies as the red horizon spread fear faster than official information could move. Laurian sent criers through every district with a controlled message. Greywood forces were containing a wildfire, and residents should stay away from roads leading north. He could not guarantee every farm was safe, but he knew panic would create additional casualties before the fire ever reached town. Because Greywood had built a reputation for keeping public promises, most residents accepted the announcement and returned indoors. Shopkeepers near the north gate opened voluntarily and handed bread and watered ale to workers marching toward the firebreak. Laurian ordered Gareth to record the businesses so every donated loaf could be reimbursed later. He wanted voluntary help rewarded, not converted into an invisible tax on people generous enough to act before being asked. Inside the forest, conditions deteriorated faster than the mercenaries' original plan could survive. Smoke became the first killer. Men coughed soot, lost direction, and dropped weapons simply to claw at throats that felt closed by heat and ash. Some ran deeper into the burn because visibility had collapsed completely. Later counts left roughly 40 hunters unaccounted for, their bodies impossible to separate from the wider destruction. Then the ground began shaking. Earth lizards, shadow wolves, tree pythons, venomous spiders, hornstags, foxes, rabbits, and smoke-blinded birds all fled ahead of the flames. They were not hunting mercenaries. They were running from death and crushing anything standing between themselves and open ground. An earth lizard hit one shield line with the force of a wagon smashing decorative fencing. Men disappeared under bodies heavier than horses before anyone could decide whether drawing a sword even mattered. Varn again survived by thinking about behavior instead of fighting instinct. He realized wild animals already knew where water and lower-risk terrain should be. He grabbed the nearest survivor and shouted for everyone to follow the fleeing herd rather than invent an escape route through smoke they could not see through. Mercenaries dropped armor, abandoned weapons, and ran behind animals they would ordinarily hunt for coin. The stampede led toward a shallow stream cutting east from the mountains. That water channel eventually helped weaken part of the fire while giving survivors a path out of the worst smoke. More than half of the original encirclement survived because they followed instinct that was not their own. When the ragged mercenaries stumbled from the burning tree line, they found Greywood's firebreak crews already working across the plains. For a moment, exhausted survivors thought the armed figures ahead might be another threat. Then Sylvie rode forward through smoke, with her fourth-tier aura impossible to mistake. She informed them that Greywood had spent the entire night containing a disaster they had created. Anyone still capable of standing would exchange weapons for shovels and join the firebreak immediately. Anyone refusing would answer to wartime security law. No one argued with Sylvie, and a line of leveled muskets behind her. Gareth ordered stretchers for men too badly injured to work, before he put the rest into digging crews. Sylvie later mentioned that choice with quiet approval in her report. Greywood's discipline remained severe, without turning wounded people into disposable obstacles. Through the night, 20,000 workers cut, dug, hauled, and rotated before exhaustion could destroy the operation from inside. By dawn, the fire reached the stripped corridor and began starving for lack of fuel. Natural streams weakened several northern arms of the blaze, while the artificial break stopped the section threatening Greywood's farmland. By dawn, the firebreak line held. Laurian walked the churned ground himself after sunrise. Workers slept sitting against shovels because walking home required energy they no longer had. He ordered hot broth, bread, and a full additional day's wage for everyone who had worked the emergency. Cecilia's apprentices had already built a field station for blistered hands, smoke-damaged throats, and minor burns without waiting for a formal order. Laurian told them to charge every salve and treatment directly to the treasury rather than subtracting anything from workers' pay. A young boy who had followed his father to the line sat with both hands bandaged, despite being too young to have been there. Laurian chose food over punishment and told the medics to feed him again before sending him home. Once the char cooled enough to search, guards entered the burned forest, looking for survivors, remains, and anything connected to Wu Ya. A covered cart eventually reached the morgue, carrying one corpse beneath a white sheet. The body was burned beyond facial recognition. What remained identifiable were half-melted pieces of silver fused near the neck and wrists. The patterns resembled the jewelry described in every intelligence report on Wu Ya. Gareth considered the body the most probable match they had found. Laurian immediately disliked the word probable. No one had witnessed Wu Ya die, and the corpse had been discovered too close to the outer edge of the burn for its position to make sense. Someone as powerful as Wu Ya should have had more time to escape that location than ordinary mercenaries who survived on foot. Odessa, the physician examining the remains, found another problem. The body showed little evidence of defensive movement before burning. It looked less like someone overwhelmed by fire, and more like something already still when the fire reached it. Odessa offered only two plausible possibilities. The woman had died by another method before the burn, or the shell on the table had never contained a conscious person at all. Laurian ordered the observation placed in the official record, instead of smoothing it away for convenience. An uncomfortable uncertainty was cheaper than building the next decision on a false confirmation. He summoned Han Yong and Li Jinshu immediately. Laurian asked whether Gu masters possessed techniques capable of leaving a convincing corpse while transferring the real user elsewhere. Han's concern grew as he read the forensic report. He described a rare technique involving a golden cicada Gu, a last resort method that could shed a substitute shell, while the practitioner escaped fatal damage. The process consumed enormous reserves and left the user dramatically weakened, but it was exactly the kind of emergency method a careful assassin might carry. A burned corpse wearing perfect identifying jewelry suddenly looked more suspicious, not less. Li Jinshu agreed that Zhao Chongxian would never accept weak proof from an operative he valued enough to send across the continent. If Wu Ya needed her employer to believe the mission remained viable, staging a convincing death could buy her recovery time as well as deceive Greywood. Laurian abandoned the small amount of relief the corpse had offered. Until hard evidence proved otherwise, Greywood would behave as though Wu Ya remained alive, dangerous, and rebuilding somewhere near the border. Gareth received orders to double patrol coverage instead of relaxing it after the fire. Water sources near the perimeter would be tested before use, antidote stocks increased, and shorter watch rotations used to keep tired eyes from missing movement. Wu Ya had lost organisms and equipment. That made her weaker than before, but weakness created an incentive to steal supplies, poison vulnerable roots, and recover through methods Greywood might not recognize. Laurian wanted every possible resupply path made expensive. Then he turned to the mercenary bounty ledger. The hunters had nearly burned his territory apart, yet they had also engaged the target and forced Wu Ya to spend valuable resources. The contract therefore remained valid. Laurian ordered every qualifying survivor, paid exactly what the notice promised. Gareth stared at him in disbelief, because those same people had created the wildfire Greywood just spent the night containing. Laurian separated the two issues completely. Breaking a bounty promise, because the contract caused another problem, would destroy the credit system that made future outsiders willing to risk themselves for Greywood. Families of the dead also received support, rather than discovering the contract vanished when the person who accepted it failed to return. Once every payment cleared, Laurian applied the second half of the law. Engaging Wu Ya had been authorized. Setting the forest on fire had not. The surviving mercenaries lined up in Greywood with bags of silver, and almost no time to enjoy them before guards surrounded the square. A magistrate announced 3 months of forced labor for reckless arson that endangered the territory. Tools and transport carts were already waiting. Several younger mercenaries protested that the fire had driven away a 5th-tier killer. The magistrate answered that Laurian's bounty never required burning the misty mountains to accomplish it. Varn looked at the coin purse in one hand and the shovel pushed into the other and laughed from pure exhaustion. He told the others they had won a payout and a sentence from the same gamble. One younger man asked what could possibly be funny. Varn answered that after surviving fire, a beast stampede, and insects controlling his friends, a shovel was the safest thing he had held in days. The punishment sent the mercenaries into road, watchtower, and supply point construction, along the same frontier they had endangered. They served the sentence without serious incident. Several eventually asked to stay as paid laborers. Because Greywood's steady wages and food were better than many contracts they had accepted voluntarily elsewhere. Varn refused permanent work and left south after completing his debt. Before departing, he visited the bounty hall one final full time, and warned that future expeditions into the Misty Mountains needed more than torches and crossbows. Laurian made sure the warning reached border officers. Useful information did not become less useful, because it came from a convicted mercenary without title or rank. The episode left Laurian with one uncomfortable truth about himself. He had intentionally used desperate outsiders as expendable censors, and felt little grief for strangers who died after voluntarily accepting the price. At the same time, he paid contracts in full, supported families, treated wounded people, and mobilized 20,000 citizens to protect every farm he could save. Laurian did not force those instincts into a moral category. Both were part of the same governing logic: preserve Greywood's core, honor commitments, and price every outside risk according to what it returned. The following morning, Laurian walked the burn line again and discovered the disaster had produced another unexpected asset. Hundreds of magical beasts lay dead, where disciplined musket volleys had stopped the stampede before it reached farms and factories. The carcasses ranged from ordinary-sized predators to creatures larger than oxen. Officers saw a cleanup problem. Laurian saw protein, trade goods, and cultivation resources that would spoil if nobody organized them before the day warmed. Magical beast meat carried residual energy capable of improving recovery and physical development when eaten regularly. For a moment, Laurian imagined feeding it to the Iron Guard for an entire year and turning ordinary troops into something much harder to break. He rejected the fantasy after considering the recurring cost. Deliberately hunting beasts at that scale would require specialists, casualties, horses, equipment, and idle payroll between expeditions. The wildfire had delivered this meat as a defensive byproduct. Free was the only price at which the volume made sense. Laurian ordered quartermasters to treat the carcasses like a harvest, with a strict spoilage deadline. Wagons, butchers, salt, and smokehouses began moving before midday. Some meat would be preserved and sold, but the first share belonged to the soldiers, laborers, scouts, and support crews who had held the firebreak. That evening, the central yard became a victory feast rather than another ration line. Huge cuts roasted over open fires while children watched from crates and exhausted workers ate until nobody wanted more. A veteran explained to a younger soldier that Southern commanders usually sold valuable monster meat and fed the troops salted fish afterward. Greywood deliberately did the exact opposite. Laurian understood the difference as long-term retention rather than generosity for its own sake. A soldier who remembered being fed well after risking his life would trust the next mobilization order faster than one who expected officers to profit from every danger. Laurian ate among the troops instead of taking a private meal. When a captain raised a cup toward him, nearby soldiers followed without anyone ordering a formal toast. Laurian refused to give a speech. The meal already communicated the outcome better than another explanation could. 2 days later, the system turned the wildfire response into a technological reward. More than 10,000 people had been mobilized and coordinated inside one continuous emergency operation. That achievement unlocked a blueprint for a basic vacuum tube radio. On Earth, the device would have been obsolete technology. In Greywood, it could move military information faster than horses, pigeons, drums, or runners for the first time in local history. Laurian immediately replayed the firebreak night in his head. Hours had been spent waiting for riders to report wind shifts and line conditions. A working radio network could cut those delays to seconds. Seconds during a wildfire, siege, or border attack could save more lives and money than the device cost many times over. Laurian carried the blueprint to the research lab himself, instead of leaving it in a drawer. Ed and Al nearly pulled the pages from his hands before he had finished unrolling them. Their laboratory was crowded with copper wire, cooling glass, half-erased equations, and projects that looked unfinished until someone understood what each experiment was trying to become. The brothers first reacted with confusion, then with the focused silence of craftsmen, realizing the design created a new category of communication. A device sending voice through open air without physical wires sounded closer to magic than engineering to them. Laurian gave the same vague explanation he used for many system designs, attributing the knowledge to distant study and correspondence. Ed estimated a crude working prototype could be transmitting within roughly 2 months if materials and a dedicated team received priority. Laurian preferred an honest 2 months over an impressive 2-week promise that quietly turned into half a year. The limiting materials would be consistent copper wire and reliable vacuum glass, rather than the basic circuit concept itself. Laurian moved the radio project to the front of the supply queue. The brothers assigned a young apprentice with unusually careful habits to handle daily engineering work. Ed trusted his skill with copper windings, while Al noted the boy had managed 2 years in the glass-heavy laboratory without breaking a single important piece. Laurian told the apprentice his own name would appear on the project record rather than disappearing beneath his master's credit. Recognition cost almost nothing and could keep talented people loyal through the difficult months when better wages elsewhere became tempting. With the border crisis contained and the radio project moving, Laurian returned to projects that looked less dramatic but mattered just as much to Greywood's future. The largest visible one was the shopping mall rising in the outer city. Laurian had committed an enormous investment to the building because the technology tree tied its completion directly to the bottling line and consumer industry branch. Concrete pillars had grown into a recognizable shell since his previous inspection. Workers crossed upper beams with the calm of people who had repeated dangerous tasks, often enough for discipline to replace fear. Mixed concrete arrived from the yard on a timed rotation, keeping the pour moving without long gaps that could weaken the structure. The foreman estimated the shell would close in roughly 2 months if dry weather continued. Laurian asked whether the wildfire emergencies had pulled too many workers from the site to protect the schedule. The foreman reported the crews had already recovered most of the lost time. Laurian cared because the mall was not ceremonial architecture. It was the physical requirement standing between Greywood and a bottling technology package with uses far beyond selling sweet drinks. He walked the unfinished concourse and imagined stalls, customers, cash flow, standardized glass containers, and a distribution system occupying the empty frame. Neighboring lords had already sent observers to study the construction from a distance. Laurian simply let the observers watch. Anyone could see reinforced concrete after the building existed, but copying a visible structure was different from reproducing the process. Labor discipline and material consistency behind it. Greywood's head start remained the real defensive advantage. From the construction site, Laurian visited the Education and Population Office to review the newborn subsidy program. The policy had begun when war and poverty kept Greywood's birth rate below the level Laurian wanted for long-term population growth. Instead of handing families coin, Greywood distributed infant formula, rice cereal, meat, eggs, and other goods tied directly to registered children. Laurian had chosen physical goods because cash created easier fraud. A fake household could invent receipts, but regular food deliveries to a specific child were harder to hide from inspectors. The office's fraud rate remained extremely low. Storerooms were organized by district and delivery date, with runners carrying supplies directly to registered addresses. If a household missed 2 scheduled deliveries, the office investigated the child's welfare, instead of simply cutting the family off the list. Laurian valued that rule because it proved the program had become more than a counting theater. The objective was keeping children alive and documented, not merely proving that the government had distributed inventory. Registrations had been rising quarter after quarter. Families trusted the program enough to plan around support that did not disappear whenever budgets became inconvenient. Laurian had promised that assistance would continue through childhood if families remained in the territory and kept children fed, healthy, and educated. The promise had looked expensive when Greywood's treasury was smaller. Now Laurian viewed it as a long-term investment in workers, taxpayers, soldiers, craftsmen, and families with a reason to stay. He ordered the office to expand intake capacity before demand overwhelmed the current building. The director surprised him by producing her own draft for an additional warehouse before Laurian finished suggesting one. That initiative mattered more than any polite agreement. A bureaucracy that identified future bottlenecks on its own was becoming a system rather than a collection of people waiting for Laurian's next instruction. Before leaving, Laurian asked whether families had begun naming children after Greywood or after him. The director admitted a few had. Laurian treated the detail less as flattery than as evidence that parents expected their children to grow up under the same government. On his way out, he passed mothers waiting with infants and baskets at the intake counter. They did not perform exaggerated deference as he moved through the room. Laurian preferred the ordinary familiarity. It meant the population increasingly treated government support as reliable infrastructure rather than a nobleman's temporary favor. That evening, Laurian trained with Han Yong in the courtyard behind his private quarters. For weeks, internal energy had been building toward a threshold meditation alone could not quite release. Han noticed the change in Laurian's breathing pattern before Laurian mentioned it. He told Laurian to stop controlling every sensation and let the breakthrough complete itself. The transition felt less like an explosion than a locked door finally opening under steady pressure. Energy that had remained concentrated near Laurian's center moved through channels his body had never used fully before. When the pressure settled, Han confirmed the result. Laurian had become a first-tier martial artist. It was his own cultivated threshold, not equipment, title, or an approximate comparison to someone else's power. Han asked him to test it with one controlled strike. Laurian attacked at roughly half the strength he believed he could produce. Han caught the wrist without moving his feet, reminding Laurian immediately how large the latter remained above first tier. The result encouraged Laurian without giving him permission to become stupid about personal strength. He asked Han how Eastern martial artists compared with Western knights at equal nominal tiers. Han explained that martial artists generally developed stronger bodies because their tradition treated the body itself as the weapon. Western knights often layered training over equipment, blessings, and inherited methods, while cultivators refined internal energy until muscle and bone carried more of the burden directly. Laurian absorbed the strategic implication. If Eastern fighters already enjoyed an individual advantage at equal rank, Greywood could not build future security around producing a few exceptional people of its own. serious cultivation still required years of training. Factories could produce rifles in weeks, once tooling and standards became mature, then train ordinary recruits in months instead of decades. That scalability remained the reason Laurian trusted industry, even after learning Earth Immortals existed. Han agreed that every tradition eventually met a rival method. It had not been designed to answer. Adaptation mattered more than loyalty to old assumptions. The conversation returned Laurian to another industrial limitation he had never solved. The unresolved dependency was still oil. Combustion engines, modern chemical processes, plastics, and many technologies in Laurian's memory depended on petroleum that Greywood had not yet located. Medieval prospecting offered only surface clues, rumors, seepage, and blind digging. Laurian had teams searching, but refused to confuse effort with discovery. He maintained a separate file collecting miners' stories, reports of burning ground, strange liquid seepage, and any geological clue that might narrow future surveys. Most of those leads went nowhere. Laurian preferred a thick file of failed attempts to pretending the dependency did not exist. He expanded prospecting farther west because an asset capable of changing the entire industrial base justified years of uncertain searching. At the same time, the mercenaries serving their arson sentences were laying roadbed near the Misty Mountains. Varn and his crew complained constantly about pace, mud, cold mornings, gravel counts, and foremen who treated every wagon load like treasury silver. One man claimed he had worked less brutally during border wars than under Greywood's road schedule. The overseers did not slow the project to protect anyone's pride. Yet the reports also showed that the sentenced laborers were fed properly and treated consistently. None attempted serious escape, because running meant trading a known sentence with food for an unpaid fugitive life in hostile country. Several admitted the arrangement was fairer than contracts they had accepted while supposedly free. Laurian privately appreciated that strange contradiction. A person could hate the work and still respect the terms. The highway itself would eventually connect mines, future rail routes, farms, and military movement through terrain that had once isolated the north. Most men building it had no idea how valuable the road would become. They cursed Laurian while creating infrastructure that would outlast their punishment by decades. To Laurian, that was another example of turning a liability into an asset, without requiring the liability to feel grateful. The radio, mall, child program, cultivation breakthrough, oil search, and new highway all moved forward at once. Laurian considered that simultaneous growth more meaningful than any single battle victory. Then the Misty Mountains returned something. Everyone had believed the wildfire had already taken. 2 weeks after the burn, a border survey crew saw movement in brush along the blackened ridge. Black trunks stood where dense forest had hidden sightlines days earlier, and ash made every footprint easier to see but harder to interpret. The shape was too small and unsteady to be an adult traveler. It was a child crawling toward the sound of road crews. She wore the remains of a scorched eastern robe, had no shoes, and protected one knotted sleeve as if it contained the last important object in the world. Her feet were cut open by rock and thorn. The patrol medic estimated she had gone several days without a proper meal. When soldiers restrained her, she endured the chains with frightened silence until a hand reached for that sleeve. Then the exhausted child fought harder for the bundle than she fought for her own freedom. What none of the surveyors understood was that the girl had once been Wu Ya. The fifth-tier Gu Master had not died in the fire. She had used a forbidden escape technique that shed most of her cultivation into a false body designed to burn in her place. The technique carried a catastrophic personal cost. Roughly 70% of her former power disappeared, and the technique burned through memory with the same violence it used to rebuild the body. It erased her mission, training, adult identity, family history, and even her own name. Her physical form reverted to something close to 10 years old. What remained inside the child's mind was less a damaged version of Wu Ya than a life with nearly every conscious connection removed. Only instinct preserved 2 small goo organisms hidden in the knotted sleeve. She did not remember why they mattered. Her body simply refused to abandon them. During the days after the fire, she had fed them almost nothing, because she possessed almost nothing. Evidence later suggested she used her own blood twice to keep them alive. The child slept beneath rock ledges, crawled when weakness made walking impossible, and kept the sleeve close through every night. When Greywood's patrol reached her, she screamed more desperately when someone touched the sleeve than when they restrained her wrists. The soldiers had been warned that Eastern infiltrators could disguise themselves as harmless refugees or children. A starving girl emerging from the same mountains where a 5th-tier assassin had supposedly died did not look innocent enough to ignore procedure. They chained her carefully, searched the ruined clothing, and found only 2 warm living shapes wrapped inside cloth. Nobody on the patrol wanted to open the bundle further in the field. The girl cried through much of the 2-day return march. The report noted that she cried quietly, with the exhausted resignation of someone who no longer expected crying to change anyone's behavior. Soldiers fed her trail rations and water. She flinched whenever hands moved near the bowl, as if food could be removed the moment she enjoyed it too openly. One guard offered to carry the protected sleeve when her arms tired. She refused so quickly that nobody offered again. The manacles were oversized because the patrol carried restraints for adults, making each movement produce a loose metallic rattle around wrists far too small for them. By the second day, the patrol had stopped expecting useful answers, because the girl seemed unable to explain even basic facts about herself. Her language confirmed Great Xiao origins, but names, locations, and family questions produced visible confusion instead of the guarded silence of a trained spy. The report reached Greywood early enough for Laurian to prevent local officers from improvising a harsher interrogation before he saw her personally. Word reached Laurian before the patrol arrived at Greywood. He ordered the child brought directly to a side room in the mansion that looked more like a plain conversation space than an interrogation chamber. Iron Guard waited outside anyway. Sylvie stood beside Laurian when the girl entered. The child was smaller than the field report had prepared him for. Dirt filled every crease of her skin. Her hair looked burned rather than cut, and her eyes constantly measured doors and distances she had no strength to use. Sylvie read the girl's internal power before Laurian asked a question. The bone age was roughly 10 years. The energy inside that body was closer to a third-tier fighter, depleted and moving through patterns Sylvie had never seen before. That mismatch was enough to justify immediate caution. He chose a side room used for sensitive conversations because setting mattered when the subject might reveal more through trust than through fear. The plain table and chairs hid the Iron Guard squad outside, giving Laurian security without making weapons the first thing the child saw. Sylvie's assessment immediately complicated every ordinary explanation for the girl's condition. A 10-year-old body should not contain energy patterns comparable to a third-tier fighter, especially while starving and physically exhausted. The cultivation inside her also moved in unfamiliar channels, tangled and depleted, rather than cleanly following Western night practice or Han Yong's martial instruction. Sylvie could identify that the power was real without identifying how it had been built. Laurian therefore approached the conversation as both an intelligence problem and a potential containment problem. Laurian's first thought, however, was not simply danger. His second thought was potential value. A child carrying an unknown adult-level martial engine represented a problem nobody in Greywood could price or classify yet. Laurian spoke in the southern language he had learned from refugees connected to the Great Xiao. The girl's face changed instantly when she heard familiar words in a place that had felt completely foreign. She did not begin by answering him. She asked where she was, what had happened, why her hands looked unfamiliar, and why she could not remember her mother's face. Laurian told her to answer calmly and honestly, and nobody in the room intended to hurt her while she cooperated. Her memories appeared only as fragments. She remembered pieces of the Great Xiao, a southern custom involving red thread, smells without places, and insects without explanations. Sometimes a tune surfaced without words and made her cry even though she could not connect the emotion to a person or event. When Laurian asked her name, she admitted she did not know it. The answer broke her composure more than any threat could have. When he asked about family, her hand moved unconsciously toward the knotted sleeve. Laurian asked what she was protecting. For the first time, the child considered lying. Then she said only that the 2 small creatures were hers and begged him not to take them away. Laurian promised nothing beyond the present moment. Nobody would remove them yet. To the girl, that sounded much larger than Laurian intended. Sylvie continued monitoring her through the conversation. Fear, confusion, hunger, and panic all appeared genuine rather than performed. The internal energy moved like a compass, unable to remember where north should be. Sylvie had exposed enough liars for Laurian that he accepted her reading. What remained unknown was the child's identity and the exact nature of the power inside her. Sylvie suggested deeper medical examination, including blood and sleep-based testing. Laurian delayed the deeper examination instead. Strapping a starving child down immediately would teach fear before Greywood learned whether trust could produce better information. He ordered simple food instead. Bread and stew arrived without heavy seasoning that might overwhelm a stomach unused to full meals. The girl stared at the bowl, as if someone had placed a rope in front of a drowning person. Then she looked at Laurian for permission. He told her to eat. She wrapped both hands around the bowl and swallowed too quickly, always watching Laurian as though he might change his mind halfway through the meal. At one point, she stopped with bread near her mouth, checking whether the food had already become forbidden. Laurian told her to continue. She finished every drop of broth and only looked embarrassed after scraping the last taste from the bowl with a finger. The performance convinced Laurian more than many interrogation techniques could have. Experienced liars could fake stories. Starvation expressed through reflex was harder to manufacture consistently. After eating, the girl asked whether she would be allowed another meal the next day. Laurian quietly told her yes. She studied his face like a merchant, examining a coin that might be clipped, then chose to believe him because she had little strength left for another possibility. That night, Laurian sat with the decision instead of delegating it. Every recent casualty told him that goo techniques were dangerous enough to keep far from his walls. Every strategic calculation told him the opposite. Greywood had almost no defense against infiltration, poison, mind control, or living weapons that bypassed ordinary fortifications. If this child carried usable goo knowledge, destroying her would preserve immediate safety while guaranteeing permanent ignorance. Keeping her created risk, but also the possibility of building Greywood's own answer to the discipline that had already killed so many soldiers. Laurian deliberately chose the larger risk. He did not describe the choice to himself as charity. The child's knowledge could be worth more than the cost of guards, food, lodging, and whatever danger followed her into the city. He brought her back into the same plain room and explained the rules in language simple enough that a frightened 10-year-old could understand. The first condition was simple obedience. Every goo organism, technique, memory fragment, and recovered method had to be disclosed to Greywood. Then Laurian stated the line that mattered most. If her insects harmed anyone under his protection, the response would be immediate and fatal. No special exception would appear because she looked young or frightened. Laurian wanted the boundary understood before comfort, made the arrangement feel less serious than it was. The girl nodded slowly and promised she would never let her creatures hurt anyone. Laurian doubted she understood the full legal weight of the promise. He believed she understood something simpler. He was the first person in her remembered life who fed her, spoke her language, and did not strike her. That was enough for her to attach survival, safety, and trust to him almost immediately. Laurian recognized how cheap that loyalty had been to purchase, and did not pretend the fact made him comfortable. The girl moved into an isolated courtyard near the edge of the city. The space had walls, clean bedding, warm clothing, food, and enough quiet that it did not resemble an ordinary prison. The arrangement was still controlled captivity. 4 elite knights rotated around the courtyard at all times. Laurian selected them for temperament as carefully as for combat ability. He needed guards capable of killing the child instantly if her swarm escaped control, but disciplined enough not to terrorize her during normal days. Fear used carelessly could destroy the cooperation Laurian was trying to build. Within the first week, one guard noticed the girl flinched at heavy boots near the gate and asked the rotation to walk more quietly there. Nobody had ordered that kindness. Laurian recorded the behavior because it showed the security arrangement was developing judgment instead of merely following a checklist. The courtyard included a small empty garden bed. The girl eventually asked for seeds. Without understanding why the request felt important, a guard brought turnip and bean seeds from kitchen stores. She planted them in crooked rows that looked less like farming than an attempt to create something guaranteed to still exist tomorrow. Laurian quietly recorded that detail too. A professional watched harmless details as carefully as dangerous ones, because habits often revealed what direct questioning could not. The goo larvae became another form of routine. She checked their condition before meals, warmed them near her body, and reacted to their agitation before guards noticed any movement in the cloth. That unconscious expertise convinced Laurian the useful knowledge had survived deeper than the autobiographical memory. Li Jinshu became the obvious interpreter because she shared language, court background, and enough Eastern cultural knowledge to recognize terminology Laurian would miss. Her assignment was not to pressure the girl into recovering everything at once. It was to record spontaneous knowledge accurately enough that Greywood could build a manual from fragments without destroying the trust producing those fragments. Li Jinshu asked practical questions about feeding first because the 2 living larvae provided safe demonstrations that did not require inventing hypothetical techniques. The girl could not explain where she learned the answers, yet she knew which meat textures the organisms accepted and which smells made them restless. She knew that too much blood accelerated growth dangerously, instead of creating a simple, stronger result. That warning became one of Laurian's most protected notes, because every future goo PAP practitioner needed to understand that feeding could destroy control rather than reinforce it. Some memories surfaced when specific words triggered them. Others appeared while the child was distracted, then vanished the moment she tried to examine them directly. During one session, she stopped in the middle of a sentence and stared at her hands for nearly a minute before continuing, as though nothing had interrupted her. Lee Jinshu marked the gap because missing information could be as important as remembered information. Week by week, the manual thickened. It described how much raw meat the two surviving larvae could safely consume. It warned that overfeeding blood too quickly could make a goo turn on the person sustaining it. Laurian ordered that warning copied into more than one secure record. Another section described the emotional link between handler and organism. The larvae grew restless when the girl became frightened and settled when her breathing slowed. One page explained how a bonded goo moved against trusted skin differently from one merely tolerating a temporary host. Laurian read that section several times. The child understood the difference between trust and bare obedience at an instinctive level, even though she could not explain who had taught her. That suggested her former life had contained relationships more complicated than simple master and weapon. Laurian did not speculate beyond what the evidence supported. He simply filed the observation beside the technical material. As the manual grew, he ordered duplicate copies of the most dangerous rules kept separately so fire, theft, or one compromised clerk could not erase everything learned. That link could become a weakness if enemies could provoke a handler, or an advantage if trained practitioners learned to regulate the swarm through their own state. Lee Jinshu eventually asked whether the girl understood what Greywood intended to do with the completed manual. Laurian answered that neither of them needed to explain the strategic purpose to a child who was already cooperating without resistance. Lee Jinshu did not argue, though her notes became warmer as the weeks passed. She recorded small jokes, moments of laughter, and signs the girl's fear was slowly losing control over every ordinary movement. Laurian read those lines too. They did not improve a weapon system directly, but they showed whether the source of that system knowledge was becoming stable enough to keep learning. The child believed Lee Jinshu was simply helping reconstruct the fog inside her memory. Every useful answer was attached to a familiar language, a patient conversation, and the expectation that nobody would punish her for not remembering enough. That environment produced more information than force probably could have. Laurian accepted the advantage without pretending the relationship was equal. The child had almost nowhere else to place trust, and Greywood had become her entire known world within weeks. Laurian used that dependence because ignoring a strategic resource would not undo the dependence itself. At the same time, he began visiting the courtyard. Most after the day's reports were filed, he told himself direct assessment was necessary for an unknown asset living behind Greywood's walls. That explanation remained accurate and gradually stopped being complete. The girl's hair grew back unevenly, the panic around meals faded, and her common tongue improved enough for small conversations. Without Lee Jinshu present, she began asking Laurian whether he had eaten before asking what dinner had been prepared for her. The question was simple, repetitive in ordinary life, and strangely difficult for Laurian to place on any ledger. He still did not tell her who he suspected she had once been, even after evidence pointed strongly toward Wu Ya. Revealing that the child's former self had killed Greywood soldiers would accomplish little beyond cruelty and confusion. Laurian withheld the truth because no useful decision depended on the child carrying that burden yet. Meanwhile, he made a second strategic decision without telling her. Tang, Laurian's fox-eared maid, and one of the people whose loyalty he trusted most completely, was summoned to his study. Laurian told her that once Lee Jinshu's manual became detailed enough, Tang would learn goo cultivation from the written knowledge. The amnesiac child would remain the source. Tang would become the controlled repository and future user. Laurian did not want Greywood's only goo expertise trapped inside someone whose forgotten history might eventually return in unpredictable ways. A weapon system that existed in only one unstable person was a vulnerability. A documented system transferred to a proven loyal defender belonged to Greywood instead. Tang accepted before Laurian finished explaining every reason. Her only question was when training would begin. Laurian refused to rush the training. Live goo cultivation was dangerous enough that Tang would start only after the manual contained sufficient procedures to reduce trial and error. Tang said she had nowhere else she needed to be. Laurian considered that steady loyalty more valuable than many dramatic declarations from people who wanted recognition for devotion. For the first time since the blood fiend swarm had broken his soldiers, Laurian could see a path toward a true countermeasure. The fear had never been insects alone. It had been the possibility that Greywood could be attacked by a discipline it had no internal method to understand or answer. The manual and Tang changed that asymmetry one page at a time. The child remained unaware of the larger plan. She lived with clean clothes, regular meals, a small garden, 4 watchful guards, and 2 dark larvae she protected with affection she could not explain. Laurian continued visiting the courtyard himself. Some evenings she asked nothing important and only showed him a new leaf growing in the garden. Other evenings, a smell, phrase, or insect movement triggered a memory fragment Li Jinshu later added to the manual. Laurian never knew which kind of visit would prove more valuable before it happened. That uncertainty helped him stop treating every minute in the courtyard as wasted time, unless it produced immediate information. He still kept the security conditions unchanged. Comfort did not erase risk. The guards retained authority to act if the swarm grew beyond control or the child's behavior changed into something actively dangerous. Laurian refused to confuse kindness with removing safeguards. The arrangement worked because both existed together. One evening, the child asked whether the 2 larvae could be given names. Laurian told her they were hers to name as long as the creatures remained under the rules already established. She spent 2 days unable to choose anything, and eventually continued calling them only hers. The failure to name them interested Li Jinshu more than Laurian. She wondered whether some buried part of the old Wu Ya already knew names had once carried ritual meaning. Laurian refused to build policy on a guess. He filed the possibility and waited for evidence. Another week brought a memory of red thread tied around wrists during a southern festival. Li Jinshu reproduced the knot from memory, and the girl began crying before she understood why. They stopped the session instead of pushing harder. Laurian approved the decision because breaking the source for one fragment would be irrational when years of knowledge might still remain buried. The manual became useful precisely because extraction moved slowly enough for trust to survive it. For the first time since Wu Ya crossed the border, Greywood was no longer responding to goof techniques only after they killed someone. It was building internal knowledge before the next practitioner appeared. Tang began reading copies of completed sections before formal cultivation started. She memorized terminology, feeding schedules, and safety warnings, so the first live lesson would not begin from total ignorance. Laurian required her to repeat critical rules back to him, rather than simply claiming she understood them. The most important rule remained the one about excess blood. A goo fed too aggressively could become dangerous to the handler, turning short-term growth into a loss of control. Tang accepted the restriction without trying to prove courage by testing limits. That response confirmed why Laurian had chosen her. He wanted judgment, not enthusiasm. As autumn deepened, Greywood's larger economy continued moving around the strange little courtyard, as if nothing unusual lived behind its walls. The harvest closed with the best results Laurian had recorded across his expanding territories. 12 territories under his banner finished above the projections he had set at planting season. Grain yields rose while spoilage fell, because new storage buildings kept damp and pests away from reserves. The raw yield mattered, but falling spoilage mattered almost as much, because new grain stores kept moisture and pests from silently consuming the harvest after collection. Laurian read the reports like production data, comparing bushels, storage losses, transport time, and the amount of reserve each district could carry into winter. The Northern Artery ration floor remained the policy tying those districts together when local conditions failed. Every registered town received a minimum basic food allocation even when its own harvest came in weak through flood, sickness, or bad seed. Laurian treated that floor as insurance against famine, migration, rebellion, and the loss of skilled labor Greywood could not replace quickly. A district that survived one bad year under Greywood remained a productive district the following spring. A district allowed to starve might never recover its experienced farmers, millers, smiths, and families. One of the first townships Laurian had absorbed under Greywood once entered winter with an empty granary and almost no reason to trust its new ruler. He fed that settlement at a loss for a full season, and the treasury needed years before later production recovered the original expense. By this autumn, the same township ranked among the strongest agricultural districts in his reports. That history was why Laurian refused to measure famine policy, only against the grain leaving a warehouse today. One Eastern steward rode to Greywood personally after his granaries came in short from poor seed and a wet spring. He expected punishment or reduced allotment. Laurian told him the guaranteed floor existed specifically for years like this one and would not disappear because the policy had finally become expensive. The steward thanked him once and left without a speech. Laurian preferred that quiet, practical result. Districts protected by the ration floor volunteered labor for roads and canals at far higher rates than districts still controlled by older hoarding systems. Trust had become measurable output, keeping the population in place, preserved future planting, tax collection, road labor, and local knowledge that no emergency shipment could recreate instantly. Laurian expanded relief beyond food by issuing basic work tools in districts where shared equipment slowed public projects. His treasurer challenged the upfront cost. Laurian asked for completed road mileage compared with the tool expense. The comparison ended the argument. A shovel in a laborer's hands produced more value than a shovel locked in a central store waiting to be borrowed. Work for relief programs also gave refugees a path into Greywood's economy without forced settlement. Anyone willing to work could earn real coin on roads, canals, warehouses, and agricultural projects. Word spread that Greywood paid laborers instead of trapping them through debt. Families crossed the border voluntarily with carts. Children, tools, and whatever belongings survived their previous homes. Laurian valued voluntary settlers because they arrived wanting the arrangement to work. They required fewer guards, adapted faster, and had already chosen Greywood before any official processed their names. Balan's family entered Greywood through that same expanding transport network, although his reputation made him a much more valuable arrival than most. Among the arrivals was the man Laurian had once toppled an earldom to recover. Balan traveled north with his daughter and 2 sons in a covered carriage, still expecting Greywood to disappoint him in some way. He had agreed to come because the offer was absurdly generous, and his daughter insisted rumors about the Northern Lord deserved investigation. Balan expected crude frontier roads, superstitious management, and craftsmen whose confidence exceeded their actual skill. The dwarf began the journey, expecting the Northern Territory to be another human frontier flattering itself with machines it barely understood. His daughter had pushed hardest for the trip after hearing merchants describe a lord who paid craftsmen according to output instead of bloodline. Balan accepted partly because the offered terms were too unusual to reject without inspecting the place first. The road began changing his expectations before Greywood town appeared anywhere on the horizon. Cement paving kept the carriage stable enough for his youngest son to sleep through terrain. Balan expected to shake teeth loose from every passenger. A dwarf raised around mountain engineering found himself leaning toward the window to examine surface drainage, joints, and how closely the road followed grade. At the first toll post, guards verified papers, weighed the cart, recorded the number, and waved the family onward without inventing another fee. Balan had crossed enough territories to expect every checkpoint to turn authority into a private marketplace for bribes. The absence of negotiation felt more suspicious to him initially than corruption would have. A second station checked the weight again, and Balan finally asked why Greywood repeated work that looked unnecessary. The guard explained that duplicate records caught smuggling and clerical mistakes, giving the dwarf a procedural answer instead of a demand to stop questioning officials. Balan remembered that exchange because systems that allowed questions usually had enough confidence to explain their rules. Farm country provided the next surprise, as plots followed rotation patterns, rather than forcing the same crop onto exhausted ground every year. Balan compared the practice to metal work, where demanding one property continuously from the same material eventually revealed flaws somebody should have respected earlier. Way stations carried preserved food, water, basic repairs, and schedules regular enough that travel no longer depended entirely on luck or hospitality from local nobles. Balan compared the system to ore management. Whoever designed the rotations understood that land, like metal, failed when people demanded the same output forever, without respecting what the material needed. Before the family reached Greywood town, they heard the factories. A steady mechanical rhythm carried through the trees after dark, too regular for hammers, and too continuous for an ordinary mill. Balan could not identify the sound. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit because experienced craftsmen dislike machines they cannot classify. He stayed awake that night, calculating what kind of workshop operated after sensible forges should have banked their fires. Thorin asked whether they should turn back. Balan refused to turn back now. A master smith who ran from an unfamiliar working sound before understanding it had no right calling himself a master. By the time the carriage resumed, Balan no longer knew whether Greywood was promising or dangerous. He only knew the rumors had failed to describe it accurately. His daughter kept asking whether every settlement in Greywood worked this way, and Balan repeatedly admitted he did not know yet. The city itself erased his remaining expectations. Balan had imagined a fortified market town centered around one lord's keep. Instead, Greywood spread in organized districts, with streets laid on grids and chimneys thick enough to stain the horizon. Size impressed him less than the social order inside it. Humans and orcs carried the same beams, argued over measurements, and worked the same jobs without the surrounding crowd, treating the pairing as unusual. Balan waited for the contempt he had experienced elsewhere. Whenever dwarves entered noble-dominated towns, the expected contempt never appeared. Merchants, guards, laborers, and clerks mostly treated his family as another household arriving for work. His daughter eventually asked why nobody stared at them. Balin had no answer beyond the growing suspicion that Greywood organized people by usefulness more readily than by species or inherited status. At the district registry, a clerk checked Balin's name, confirmed housing, listed family supplies, and handed him keys without ceremony. His forge had already been stocked. Coal, food, and household provisions had been drawn before his carriage entered the city. Balin found the routine efficiency more surprising than a parade would have been. It meant Greywood had processed enough skilled migrants that welcoming one famous craftsman no longer required improvisation. Outside the registry, Balan told his daughter this might be the best decision of his life. He had not lifted a hammer yet. What changed his mind was the possibility that skill would determine his position more strongly than prejudice or a noble's mood. He inspected the assigned forge before unpacking the family luggage. Every essential tool was sharp, placed logically, and ready for work. To Balan, that preparation revealed more respect than a speech praising dwarven craftsmanship would have. The district steward delivered a hot meal that evening, under the same relief rules applied to other newly settled families. Balan's sons expected a hidden fee. There was no hidden fee at all. The next morning, Balan followed the mechanical sound toward a foundry operating across 3 shifts. Workers changed stations according to a posted schedule without overseers screaming or using punishment to force every movement. Balin watched the shift change for almost an hour. A passing worker explained that the foundry produced rail fits and cart axles and parts for something called the gun line. Balin did not know what a gun line was. For a master smith, that became an irresistible problem rather than an insult. Within days, Greywood's foreman brought him to the musket production floor and showed him a bottleneck nobody else had solved. The line produced parts that looked identical, but refused to fit each other consistently. Barrels needed hand filing before they would seat in receivers that should have accepted them directly. Every rejected fit consumed skilled labor and destroyed the throughput Laurian wanted from standardized manufacturing. Laurian had walked the same floor repeatedly, watching workers perform custom correction on parts that were supposed to be interchangeable. Balin did not begin by offering theories. He took calipers and measured pieces against each other for days. When supervisors asked whether he had discovered the problem, Balan answered that reporting guesses wasted both his time and theirs. Laurian respected the refusal to manufacture confidence before evidence existed. On the 3rd day, Balan identified the real failure. The machines were not the primary problem. The measurement standard itself drifted by fractions too small for casual inspection, but large enough to compound across an assembly. Balin rebuilt the gauge system from the foundation. He cut master templates by hand, checked each against the last, and established tolerances precise enough that Monday parts matched Friday assemblies without individual filing. Then he trained younger apprentices to repeat the procedure. Balin insisted a method was not solved until someone besides the inventor could perform it correctly. Laurian agreed for strategic reasons. Knowledge trapped inside one genius disappeared if that genius became sick, left, or died. Knowledge embodied in gauges, templates, and written procedures belonged to Greywood as a system. Once the system stabilized, workers began assembling parts selected from separate racks without correcting every fit by hand. The change pushed output toward 30 muskets per day, while reducing the amount of skilled labor wasted rescuing almost correct components. Within a week, the musket line stabilized near 30 finished weapons per day. The important change was not the number alone. Every weapon now used parts that could be replaced from general inventory instead of requiring the original smith to custom fit a repair. A border garrison could keep spare components rather than whole spare guns. Damaged weapons could return to service faster, with less shipping weight and less specialized labor. Standardization turned each musket from an isolated craft object into one node of a larger supply network. Laurian watched a worker take a barrel from one rack, a receiver from another, and assemble them without touching a file. That moment justified everything Balan had spent days measuring. Laurian told the dwarf that a repeatable process was worth more to him than any single genius, including Balin himself. Balin laughed instead of taking offense. A real master understood exactly why reproducibility proved the work had succeeded. The stabilized gun line finally completed the system requirement for 100 standard muskets. When Greywood crossed the musket production requirement, the system unlocked the weapon Laurian had been waiting for. A complete design for a breech-loading, double-barreled shotgun appeared together with paper cartridge specifications and the manufacturing steps needed to support it. Laurian stayed awake late studying the drawings against Balin's new tolerance standards. For the first time, the blueprint demanded precision. Greywood could actually reproduce instead of precision that existed only on paper. The locking surfaces, pressure limits, chamber dimensions, and cartridge fit all depended on repeatability Balin had just established. Paper cartridges also connected weapon performance to cotton, papermaking, chemical consistency, and mass handling rather than to metalwork alone. The following morning, Laurian carried the plans to Balin's forge himself. He wanted the dwarf's first reaction, without a clerk or messenger filtering the moment. Balin unrolled the pages and went silent after less than a minute. The tolerances matched the new gauge system almost perfectly. Stress calculations assumed combustion pressures no local weapon had ever used, while the cartridge design treated reload time as an engineering problem instead of a soldier's unavoidable limitation. Balin asked where the design came from. Horin claimed he had drafted it during the night. The answer sounded impossible, even after Balin checked the calculations twice and failed to find a serious error. Thorin asked whether Laurian had truly drawn every line alone. Balin answered the question for his son with one reluctant nod. Balin's daughter asked whether Laurian had slept. Laurian admitted he had barely rested. Later, Balin joked to his family that a man producing designs like that without sleep would either remake the continent or destroy himself trying. Either way, Balin intended to stand close enough to see which happened. Laurian told him to take the time required for a correct weapon rather than racing toward a date for appearances. Balin canceled his planned rest day anyway, because nobody needed to threaten a master craftsman who wanted to see a difficult design become real. 3 days later, the prototype opened at the breach, accepted 2 paper cartridges, and locked closed with mechanical certainty. Laurian and Balin tested it behind the forge. 2 shots cracked within the span of a heartbeat. No ordinary firearm on the continent could match that immediate follow-up speed. Thorin began asking how many could be produced in a season if the tolerance line held. Balin's daughter picked up a spent paper cartridge and asked whether Greywood could manufacture the paper locally at scale. Laurian answered that cotton blend mills already produced materials suitable for experimentation. The family immediately began performing separate versions of the same calculation Laurian had already started: unit cost, cartridge output, machine tooling, barrel production, and the number of weapons Greywood might distribute. Before Southern rivals understood what had changed, Balin stood with soot on his hands grinning at a weapon that only weeks earlier would have sounded impossible. The prototype did not end the production problem. It gave Greywood a new problem valuable enough to solve at scale. The breakthrough mattered because it linked 3 separate developments. Balin's rescue gave Greywood the craftsman capable of stabilizing precision. Standardized precision completed the system achievement. The achievement produced a design that demanded exactly that new precision to exist at scale. Laurian considered the loop almost perfect. Before he could devote the entire territory to weapons, another system-linked project reached completion in the commercial district. Greywood's shopping mall opened on a clear autumn morning. 4 stories of red brick, reinforced concrete, broad windows, and organized interior space dominated the town square in a way no surrounding market building could match. Laurian inspected every floor before the public entered. The first level focused on household goods ordinary families could actually afford. Water-resistant raincoats hung in colors. Local weavers struggled to keep consistent. Safe matches eliminated much of the fumbling and spark risk of older fire-starting methods. Small threshing attachments gave individual farms access to mechanical help without requiring the capital of a noble estate. Laurian cared about the price points as much as the novelty. A product nobody could afford was an exhibition piece, not a consumer industry. The second floor held goods designed to create stronger desire. Thermos bottles kept water hot for hours without a nearby fire. Stained glass appeared in patterns and consistency. Southern workshops rarely achieved at large volume. Enamel cookware resisted rust long enough to change how often a household needed replacement pots. Laurian deliberately accepted thinner margin on some durable goods. A family that trusted one Greywood product would buy the next with less hesitation, and repeated trust reduced future selling cost. The third floor made several advisors nervous, because tools and machine parts were available to outsiders with enough money to purchase them. Laurian considered that acceptable, because owning one tool did not reproduce the training, gauges, workflow, supply chain, and maintenance system that made the tool productive. He was willing to sell visible hardware while keeping process knowledge moving faster than any customer could copy it. The fourth floor remained closed to casual shoppers because its purpose was not retail at all. It contained negotiation rooms, sample cases, contract offices, and the commercial mechanism Laurian had planned long before construction started. A showcase without a way to convert foreign interest into supply was only expensive decoration. Negotiation rooms, specification samples, contract tables, and private offices converted consumer excitement below into raw material commitments above. Laurian had designed that separation intentionally so the mall could serve ordinary residents without letting large merchant houses crowd them out physically or commercially. When the doors opened, the ground floor filled faster than expected. Clerks had to limit entry so the main aisles did not collapse into a single immobile crowd. From the mezzanine, Laurian watched people react to objects that would have been ordinary in his old world. An elderly woman lifted a thermos as if warmth might be physically trapped inside the metal. Children pressed fingers against stained glass until a clerk politely moved them back. Off-duty soldiers argued over whether the raincoats would survive Eastern Marsh patrols until one man bought several at once and ended the debate. A mother struck a match at the counter and stared at the clean first ignition as though the tiny flame proved a rumor true. Each purchase was small by itself. Across thousands of households, those purchases represented a revenue stream independent of grain, taxes, weapons, or land expansion. Laurian saw revenue in those reactions, but he also saw adoption speed, which mattered more for creating a permanent market. Each ordinary sale taught customers that Greywood products solved problems exactly as advertised, making the next unfamiliar item easier to trust. One southern merchant named Benson moved through the displays differently from casual visitors. He spent less time asking the price of one item and more time estimating the value of controlling distribution across entire regions. Benson had built his career trading textiles and already knew how quickly a profitable route disappeared once competitors recognized it. He arrived expecting a provincial curiosity he could mark up and resell. Instead, he stayed almost the entire day taking notes. Before leaving, Benson asked how a serious merchant house obtained distribution rights outside Greywood. The clerks directed him upstairs. The southern trader had built his career moving cloth and understood that the value of a raincoat was not one purchase, but the number of rainy households across entire regions. He had recently lost money after arrival, undercut a committed shipment, which made him especially sensitive to profits competitor could not immediately match. Benson spent most of the first day writing observations rather than bargaining, a behavior Laurian recognized as serious interest rather than hesitation. By the fourth day, the fourth floor had become the real center of Laurian's commercial strategy. Agents from southern merchant houses gathered around a long negotiation table, with Laurian's commercial governor leading the discussion. Laurian sat toward the back because his authority mattered without requiring him to perform every sentence personally. The governor began with a rule many agents disliked immediately. The best ground floor stalls near the public entrance were permanently reserved for small independent merchants and ordinary Greywood residents. Large chambers of commerce and powerful houses could not buy, lease, or pressure their way into those positions. Several agents objected that major firms expected the best placement in any market they helped expand. The governor answered that Greywood's own people came first, and the rule was not available for negotiation. One agent asked whether the restriction applied only to the new mall. The governor said similar ownership protections existed anywhere Greywood controlled public market space. Another asked what would happen if a large house quietly purchased a small merchant through an intermediary. Greywood's registry cross-checked ownership, and any house caught bypassing the rule would lose distribution rights entirely. The room stopped testing that boundary. The governor then opened product samples and moved into the part the merchants actually wanted. On the mall's fourth floor, Greywood's governor cut sample products open so southern agents could inspect what they were actually being asked to distribute. A raincoat seam was turned inside out to show how water was kept from finding a path through the stitching. A thermos demonstration exposed the two walls and sealed gap responsible for holding heat instead of asking merchants to trust a sales claim. Raincoat seams, thermos construction, matches, cookware, and future industrial goods all represented routes southern firms could profit from enormously. An agent asked whether competent craftsmen could reverse engineer the products after purchasing enough samples. The governor answered honestly that some designs could probably be copied eventually. Greywood's advantage was that by the time competitors reproduced one generation, its factories intended to be selling the next. That response made the relationship clearer than any threat. The merchants were not buying a single secret. They were buying access to an industrial pipeline that expected to keep moving. Then the governor explained what distribution rights actually cost. Greywood did not primarily want cash at the front of the contract. Any merchant house receiving access had to deliver fixed recurring quantities of raw materials the territory struggled to source domestically. The list included rubber, high-purity sulfur, cotton, and rare minerals needed by expanding factories and research projects. Deliveries would continue on a seasonal schedule, with penalties for shortfalls. A first failure created a financial penalty. Repeated failure could suspend distribution rights until the deficit was replaced with interest measured against missed quantity. A third serious shortfall in 1 year could void the contract completely without guaranteed renegotiation. One older agent asked whether Greywood had ever enforced penalties that severe. The governor named 2 smaller houses removed earlier that year and invited everyone to verify the public records themselves. Their former routes had already been absorbed by competitors who honored the same terms. The threat became credible because it was not theoretical. One angry agent accused Greywood of dressing extortion in commercial language. The governor replied that nobody was required to sign. The alternative was letting a competitor accept the contract and take the distribution territory first. That competitive pressure was already enough. One by one, the agents signed because refusal carried a visible opportunity cost larger than the discomfort of Laurian's terms. Benson signed last and read every line twice. Before putting down his name, he asked whether Greywood expected future material quotas to increase when contracts renewed. The governor answered that it probably would. Benson signed anyway, proving he understood the structure and still considered access profitable. By the end of the meeting, Greywood had commitments from multiple ports and growing regions for rubber, sulfur, cotton, and rare minerals. The merchants had traveled north chasing finished goods. They left having turned their own trade networks into the raw material pipeline. Laurian needed to manufacture even more finished goods. That reversal was the fourth floor's real purpose. Laurian preferred material commitments because coin sitting in the treasury did not solve shortages in a factory waiting on feedstock. A merchant network able to gather rubber from distant regions was more valuable than the same merchant paying silver. Laurian would then spend rebuilding that network himself. That proof mattered because a penalty nobody believes will be used is simply decoration surrounding a request. Greywood's credibility therefore operated in both directions. It paid exactly what it promised and collected exactly what contracts required. The combination made deals harsh but predictable, which serious traders often preferred to generous terms controlled by a noble's changing mood. That was the result Laurian wanted. Merchants choosing dependency because the measurable returns still exceeded the cost. No Southern army had been defeated to secure those routes. Contracts and superior products had accomplished something occupation would have required soldiers to defend continuously. Laurian reviewed every quantity after the room emptied. No negotiation produced perfect numbers, but the commitments were sufficient for him to begin adjusting next season's production with real confidence. The mall, therefore, did more than satisfy a system requirement. It generated household consumption downstairs and industrial supply upstairs at the same time. That evening, Laurian watched lanterns moving through the square from his study, while the building closed for the night. Greywood now fed itself, armed itself, manufactured consumer goods, and forced established merchant houses to negotiate on northern terms. His chancellor had recently begun raising another possibility. With 12 territories, unmatched industry, growing military power, and a treasury larger than many neighboring courts, Laurian could pursue an imperial throne. Other subordinates repeated the idea in softer forms, mentioning crowns, coronations, and the prestige of turning practical power into recognized sovereignty. Laurian considered the proposal and found it surprisingly boring. He did not reject the throne because taking it looked impossible. He rejected it because a crown meant sitting inside a political system built by dead rulers, whose assumptions Laurian already considered inefficient. An emperor inherited succession laws, noble privileges, ceremonial expectations, and generations of tradition designed to preserve people who produced little beyond pedigree. Laurian had spent years building the opposite structure. Greywood's roads, grain stores, foundries, contracts, and production lines did not exist because ancient custom granted them legitimacy. They existed because somebody solved concrete problems well enough that workers, refugees, merchants, and craftsmen kept choosing the system. Laurian had not absorbed territories primarily by marching banners through them. He fed districts their own rulers could not feed. He paid labor their old economies could not support. He connected roads until joining Greywood looked less like surrender and more like the rational option. A crown could not have convinced Balin to stay after one day in the city. Prepared tools, fair treatment, and an industrial problem worthy of his skill did that. A crown could not have solved the musket tolerance bottleneck. Precise gauges, patient measurement, and standardization solved it. A crown could not have turned southern merchant houses into Greywood suppliers without a battle. products those merchants wanted, and contracts they feared losing did that. Laurian compared those forms of power and saw little reason to trade them for a more visible chair. Traditional emperors depended heavily on stories about blood, divine right, and inherited legitimacy. Laurian preferred supply chains that continued functioning even if nobody felt inspired by him personally. Remove an emperor's crown, and much of his authority might vanish with the symbol. Remove Laurian's title, and Greywood's musket line would still produce weapons the next morning. Granaries would still distribute food. Factories would still need raw materials. Sign merchants would still deliver cargo because the contracts remained profitable enough to honor. Laurian wanted a structure capable of surviving even the loss of Laurian himself. A monarchy concentrated risk in one throne, one succession line, and one ruler whose death could throw the whole state into conflict. Greywood increasingly spread power through roads, inventories, procedures, industrial standards, offices, and contracts that did not need his physical presence every hour. That decentralization was less glamorous and far harder to assassinate. Below Laurian's window, clerks finished inventory while delivery lanterns kept moving after the mall's public doors closed. Southern courts could keep measuring power through bloodlines and banners, while Greywood measured output, supply, standards, and reliability. Every season those courts spent arguing over inheritance gave his factories another season to become harder to replace. He did not need a crown to prove. Greywood had changed the arithmetic of power. He was building the world that would decide what a crown was worth.